I forgot to tell my daughter that I fixed the smart doorbell at her new house. 3 days later, I accidentally checked the live security footage and was horrified to discover her perfect fiance choking a strange woman on the front porch. That Sunday night, the carefully constructed illusion of our family shattered into a million sharp pieces, and I realized the man about to marry my only child was a ruthless monster. I am Nathaniel, 68 years old, and I am a retired smart home systems engineer. Before I continue this deeply personal story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father must do absolutely whatever it takes to protect his flesh and blood from predators in tailored suits. My daughter Jada is 32 years old and a brilliant trauma surgeon. She spends her days saving lives in one of the busiest emergency rooms in Atlanta. She is fiercely intelligent in the operating room, but entirely too trusting when it comes to matters of the heart. Her mother passed away 10 years ago, leaving me to protect her in a world that often preys on successful, kind-hearted women. 6 months ago, she met Blake Montgomery. Blake is a 35-year-old white financial consultant. He drives a sleek imported vehicle, wears expensive watches, and possesses a smile that is perfectly practiced, but never truly reaches his cold eyes. Jada fell completely under his spell. She recently bought a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a highly exclusive neighborhood. It was supposed to be her safe sanctuary. Blake moved in immediately, bringing nothing but a few designer suitcases and a whole lot of arrogance. From the very first dinner we shared, Blake treated me with a sickeningly sweet condescension. He would speak to me very slowly, using simple words as if my age had severely eroded my cognitive abilities. He loved to offer me unsolicited advice on my modest retirement portfolio, chuckling when I politely declined. He genuinely believed I was just an obsolete old man who spent his days doing crossword puzzles and struggling to operate a television remote control. He possessed absolutely no idea that I spent 34 years designing heavily encrypted security networks for commercial government contractors. Last week, Jada complained over the phone that her brand new, ridiculously expensive home security system was glitching. The front doorbell camera kept dropping its wireless connection. When I offered to come over and take a look, Blake intercepted the call. He told me in that patronizing tone I had come to despise that I should not trouble my old joints. He claimed the technology was highly complex and required a certified network technician. He actually said I might electrocute myself or accidentally break the warranty. I simply smiled into the phone and told him to have a wonderful day. The next morning, while Jada was scrubbing into surgery and Blake was supposedly at his high-rise office building, I drove over to their new house. I let myself in with the spare key Jada had given me. I stood on the front porch, popped the sleek black casing off the smart doorbell, and immediately spotted the problem. The amateur technicians who installed it had used a cheap, unshielded wire that was catching interference from the metal door frame. I bypassed the faulty factory wiring in less than 10 minutes. I then took it a step further. I reconfigured the software, boosting the camera resolution and syncing the master video feed directly to my own secure encrypted server at my house. I meant to tell Jada about the security upgrade over dinner, but the conversation shifted to wedding venues and the doorbell completely slipped my mind. On Friday evening, I was sitting in my favorite leather recliner, nursing a glass of bourbon and reading a technical manual. The house was dead silent. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table. It was not a standard motion alert indicating a delivery driver or a passing car. It was a critical proximity warning from the primary front door camera I had just rewired. The system had detected violent, erratic movement on the porch. I set my glass down. I picked up my phone and opened the administrative dashboard. I fully expected to see a neighborhood stray dog knocking over the decorative planters or a drunken neighbor lost in the dark. The application loaded instantly. The high-definition infrared feed filled my screen, bathing the front porch in a harsh, ghostly white glow. I froze completely. My breath caught in my throat. Blake was standing on the porch. He was not wearing his usual tailored business suit. He wore a dark hooded sweatshirt and black leather gloves. His face, usually so composed and smug, was violently twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. The mask of the perfect son-in-law was gone. His large hands were wrapped tightly around the throat of a woman I had never seen before. She was a slender woman thrashing wildly against the heavy oak front door. Her feet kicked desperately against the welcome mat. She clawed frantically at his wrists, her face contorting in sheer terror as she fought for oxygen. I turned the volume up on my phone, my hands shaking with an icy, calculated fury. The upgraded microphone picked up the audio with terrifying clarity. I heard the desperate, wet gasps of the struggling woman. And then I heard Blake. His voice was not loud. It was a low, venomous whisper devoid of any human empathy. He told her she was going to ruin everything he had built. He called her a pathetic liability. He leaned his face inches from hers and told her that if she ever came near his new life again, if she ever dared to contact Jada, he would bury her deep in the Georgia woods where absolutely nobody would ever find her remains. He squeezed harder, and the woman let out a choked, agonizing whimper. The polite, charming financial expert who bought my daughter long-stem roses every single Friday was a seasoned predator capable of murder. I watched the screen in absolute horror, my heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribs. Every protective instinct I had honed over a lifetime screamed at me to grab my service weapon and drive straight to that house. I reached for my desk phone to dial the police emergency line. I had to stop him before he snapped her neck. But then the struggling woman managed to bring her right knee up. She struck Blake hard in the groin. He cursed loudly, his voice echoing in the night air, and loosened his grip for a fraction of a second. The woman collapsed to the cold concrete floor, violently gasping for air, her hands clutching her bruised throat. As she fell against the brick siding, a thick, heavy manila folder slipped from the inside pocket of her jacket. It hit the ground, sliding directly under the glaring lens of the smart camera. The lens auto-focused instantly on the document. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The camera captured the bold black letters printed across the top of the folder. It was the exact, unmistakable logo of Hayes & Sons Construction, the commercial building company I had owned, operated, and successfully sold over 15 years ago. I paused the live video. I used my thumb and index finger to zoom in closely on the paused frame, staring at the old familiar logo of my life work. My mind raced through 1,000 terrifying possibilities. Why did a strange woman who was being brutally choked by my daughter's fiance in the middle of the night have my old company private financial records dropped on my daughter's front porch? I stared at the frozen frame of my old company logo on the security video. I did not waste time sitting in my armchair trying to make sense of a ghost from my past. I grabbed my car keys, a heavy steel flashlight, and a concealed carry weapon I had not holstered in over 5 years. I drove through the quiet suburban streets of Atlanta with a cold and terrifying clarity. My only daughter was planning to marry a predator, and he was currently operating inside her new home. I did not speed. I obeyed every traffic law because drawing attention from the police right now would ruin any element of surprise. My mind calculated the distance, the layout of the property, and the various ways this confrontation could unfold. I parked my truck 2 blocks away from Jada and Blake's new house. I did not want the sweep of my headlights alerting anyone inside. The night air was thick and heavy with southern humidity. I walked the remaining distance on foot, keeping strictly to the dark shadows cast by the large oak trees lining the neighborhood sidewalk. The beautiful house looked entirely peaceful from the street. The front porch was completely empty. There was absolutely no sign of the struggling woman, no sign of the manila folder, and no visible evidence of a violent assault. The smart doorbell I had just repaired glowed with an innocent blue ring, functioning flawlessly and silently transmitting its feed to my private server. I did not walk up the front steps to ring that bell. Instead, I moved silently down the side path toward the detached 3-car garage located at the back of the property. The heavy wooden garage doors were closed tight, but a thin, harsh strip of fluorescent light spilled out from underneath the center door. I also smelled the evidence long before I reached the concrete driveway. The sharp, toxic, and overwhelming scent of industrial bleach and heavy-duty carpet cleaner cut right through the natural smell of the damp night air. You do not use industrial bleach to clean up a simple household spill. I approached the side entry door of the garage. It was cracked open just a few inches. I pushed it gently, just enough to see inside without making a sound. Blake was standing directly behind his pristine silver luxury sport utility vehicle. The rear cargo liftgate was wide open. He had already stripped off the dark hooded sweatshirt he was wearing in the security video. He was now wearing a plain white undershirt, and his expensive dress slacks were heavily stained at the knees. He was scrubbing the custom fabric floor mats of the cargo area with a stiff, bristled brush and a large bucket of foaming chemical solvent. His movements were frantic, rushed, and almost manic. The veins in his neck and forearms bulged visibly as he dug the heavy brush aggressively into the trunk lining. I took a deep breath, shifted my posture to appear completely relaxed, and stepped fully into the garage. I let my heavy boots thud loudly against the concrete floor. I called out his name in a calm, steady, and cheerful voice. Blake spun around so fast he violently knocked the plastic bucket over. Foaming bleach and dirty water spilled across the concrete floor, splashing directly onto his expensive leather shoes. For a fraction of a second, his carefully constructed mask completely slipped. I saw raw, unadulterated panic flash in his pale blue eyes. He looked exactly like a cornered animal staring directly down the barrel of a loaded shotgun. His chest heaved up and down as his brain struggled to process my sudden and uninvited appearance in his workspace. Then the terrifying transformation happened. It was deeply chilling to witness just how quickly and smoothly he rearranged his facial features. The genuine panic dissolved instantly into a strained, incredibly fake smile. He wiped his sweating forehead with the back of his wrist and let out a forced hollow chuckle. He asked me what on earth I was doing sneaking around their property in the middle of the night. He tried his best to sound like an amused and friendly son-in-law, but his vocal pitch was half an octave too high. His breathing remained suspiciously shallow and fast. I kept my facial expression entirely neutral. I told him I had accidentally left my specialized wire crimping tool on the front porch earlier that afternoon when I came over to inspect the faulty doorbell wiring. I lied smoothly and effortlessly, telling him I simply could not sleep and decided to swing by to grab the tool before an early morning fishing trip. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to the back of the silver vehicle. I looked at the chemical mess on the floor and asked him what kind of late-night accident required so much heavy-duty bleach at 2:00 in the morning. Blake immediately stepped sideways, subtly shifting his body weight to block my line of sight into the deep interior of the trunk. He gripped the wooden handle of the scrub brush so tightly his knuckles turned completely white under the harsh garage lighting. He let out another perfectly timed, dismissive laugh. He claimed he had picked up a case of rare, imported red wine for Jada as a surprise celebration gift, and one of the bottles had violently shattered in the back on his drive home. He stated that red wine stains set very quickly into upholstery, and he wanted the car looking absolutely perfect for their upcoming weekend getaway. It was a remarkably smooth and well-rehearsed lie. But I could clearly see a dark, damp stain actively seeping into the concrete floor directly beneath the rear bumper of the car. The fluid dripping from the undercarriage was definitely not the color of imported Burgundy wine. I nodded my head slowly, pretending to completely accept his ridiculous explanation. I told him it was a terrible shame about the wasted wine, but that Jada would surely appreciate his dedicated effort to keep her vehicle clean. I turned my back to him and began walking slowly toward the open side door. It took every single ounce of military discipline I possessed not to draw my weapon right then and drop him to the floor. I could physically feel his cold eyes boring into the back of my skull. I knew he was calculating whether I was a genuine threat who had seen too much or just a senile, wandering old fool stumbling around in the dark. As I stepped over the metal threshold of the side door, the toe of my boot brushed against something hard resting near the edge of the damp driveway grass. I glanced down briefly. Half hidden in the shadows was a piece of shattered glass firmly attached to a twisted black wire frame. I recognized the item instantly. It was the right lens of a pair of prescription eyeglasses. They were the exact same distinct thick black frames worn by the desperate woman who had been fighting for her very life on the front porch just 1 hour ago. Blake had clearly dropped them in his frantic rush to drag her or her belongings out to the car. I did not break my stride or stop walking. Instead, I intentionally dropped my heavy key ring onto the concrete, cursing loudly about my clumsy arthritic fingers. I bent down, slowly scooped up my keys, and smoothly palmed the broken glasses frame in the same fluid motion. I slipped the twisted metal deep into the heavy pocket of my jacket. I called out a final friendly goodnight to Blake without looking back over my shoulder. He replied with a booming, cheerful voice that echoed unnaturally in the quiet night, telling me to drive safely and get some rest. I walked the 2 long blocks back to my parked truck. My heart felt like a solid block of ice inside my chest. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked all the doors, and pulled the broken glasses from my pocket. The glass lens was completely shattered, and the metal hinge was bent violently backward, indicating a massive physical impact. I placed the evidence carefully into the center console of my truck. Before I could even reach forward to start the engine, the screen of my cell phone illuminated the dark cabin. It was a text message notification from Jada. I opened the message, and the words felt like a physical punch directly to my gut. She wrote that Blake had just woken her up because he was deeply concerned about my well-being. He told her I was wandering around their property in the dark, acting incredibly confused, paranoid, and aggressively demanding to inspect his car. She told me my behavior was completely out of line and inappropriate. She wrote that my constant hovering was starting to really bother Blake and I needed to respect their boundaries as a couple. She ended the message by firmly telling me to go home, get some sleep, and promised to see a medical doctor about my worsening memory lapses. I sat in the dark truck and stared at the glowing screen. He was already actively spinning the narrative to his advantage. He was already building a solid brick wall between me and my daughter, using my senior age as a convenient weapon to discredit anything I might try to say against him. He honestly thought he had outsmarted me. He truly believed he had successfully painted me as a frail, intrusive old man slowly losing his grip on reality. I reached forward and started the engine of my truck. I did not type a reply to her message. Defending myself or arguing with her over text would only feed perfectly into his carefully constructed lie. Instead, I put the truck in gear and drove away from the silent neighborhood. My mind completely shifted away from being a loving father and locked into a cold, tactical gear I had not utilized since my days designing military defense grids. Blake Montgomery thought he was playing a clever game of emotional manipulation. The arrogant fool had absolutely no idea he had just declared war on a man who knew exactly how to dismantle a target piece by piece, wire by wire. The invitation for Sunday dinner arrived the very next morning via a short, tightly worded phone call from Jada. She did not ask if I was free. She stated that I needed to come over at 6 o'clock sharp so we could discuss my recent erratic behavior like mature adults. I spent the entire Sunday afternoon running the security footage through a specialized enhancement software I had built from scratch. I needed to isolate the license plate of the vehicle parked in the background of the video. I also needed to keep my mind sharply focused. I took a cold shower, put on a clean button-down shirt, and drove back to the house where I had nearly drawn my weapon the night before. When I walked through the front door, the heavy scent of roasted garlic and expensive red wine filled the hallway. It was a perfect domestic illusion, completely masking the toxic chemical stench I knew still lingered in the detached garage. Blake greeted me in the foyer wearing a tailored cashmere sweater, holding a polished crystal wine glass. He extended his hand toward me with a wide, welcoming smile. It was the kind of smile a politician gives to a camera. I ignored his outstretched hand, took off my coat, and walked straight into the dining room. Jada was setting the table. She looked exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes told me she had pulled a double shift at the hospital dealing with real trauma, only to come home to the manufactured drama Blake was feeding her. She kissed my cheek, but her posture was incredibly stiff. She told me to sit down. The dinner was an excruciating exercise in psychological warfare. Blake served a perfectly cooked roast, pouring wine and playing the role of the ultimate caring provider. For the first 20 minutes, he kept the conversation deliberately light, asking Jada about her surgical cases and complimenting the decor of the house. Then, right as we began eating, he smoothly shifted the target onto my back. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured pity. He turned his head slightly toward Jada and began speaking about me in the third person, as if I were a deaf patient sitting in a waiting room. He mentioned an article he had read in a medical journal regarding the early onset of dementia in older men. He spoke about how isolation and retirement often lead to paranoia, confusion, and a complete detachment from reality. Jada stopped eating. She looked at me with a mixture of anger and genuine medical concern. Blake continued his performance flawlessly. He recounted his version of the previous night. He described how he was simply cleaning his car in the garage, minding his own business, when I suddenly appeared out of the dark shadows, demanding to inspect his trunk and mumbling incoherently about wire-crimping tools. He told Jada that I looked lost, agitated, and potentially dangerous to myself. He reached across the table and gently squeezed Jada's hand, telling her that they needed to consider finding a professional neurologist for me before I accidentally hurt someone. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against his ridiculous medical diagnosis. I slowly wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, placed my fork down on the expensive china plate, and reached into the deep pocket of my trousers. I pulled out the twisted black metal frame and the shattered glass lens I had recovered from their driveway. I tossed the broken eyeglasses directly onto the center of the dining table. The heavy metal clattered loudly against the polished wood, stopping inches away from Blake's wine glass. The dining room fell completely silent. Jada jumped slightly in her chair, staring at the jagged piece of glass resting next to the gravy boat. She looked from the glasses to me, her forehead deeply wrinkled in confusion. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Blake. I asked him to explain to Jada exactly what kind of late-night garage cleaning accident resulted in a woman's shattered prescription eyeglasses resting in the grass near his rear bumper. I asked him if the imaginary broken wine bottles he claimed to be cleaning up somehow wore corrective lenses. For a fraction of a second, the muscles in his jaw tightened so fiercely I thought his teeth might crack. The color briefly drained from his face. But the predator inside him was highly trained. He did not stutter. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and shook his head slowly, looking at Jada with an expression of profound sadness. He told Jada that this was exactly what he had been talking about. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the broken glasses on the table. He stated in a calm, soothing voice that it was literally a piece of random street garbage. He claimed I must have picked up trash from the gutter during my confused midnight wandering and brought it into their home to create a paranoid conspiracy. He looked at Jada and whispered that my condition was clearly escalating faster than he feared. I opened my mouth to tell Jada about the security footage, about the woman he was choking on the porch, about the folder bearing my old company logo. But before I could speak a single word, Jada slammed her hands down on the dining table. The silverware violently rattled against the plates. She stood up from her chair, her eyes blazing with absolute fury. She was not angry at Blake, she was furious at me. She shouted that she spent her entire week repairing broken human bodies in the emergency room, and the one place she deserved to have peace was in her own home. She accused me of actively trying to sabotage her happiness because I could not accept that she was building a life with a man who was not me. She said I was letting my stubborn pride and my old age poison my mind. She looked at the broken glasses on the table with disgust, calling my actions pathetic and completely unhinged. I sat there absorbing the crushing weight of her words. She was a brilliant surgeon, but right now she was entirely blind. Blake had successfully weaponized her medical background, her exhaustion, and her love for him to build a fortress around his lies. If I pushed harder right now, if I started screaming about hidden video cameras and attempted murder without a police report to back it up, I would only prove his point. I would become the crazy old man they needed to lock away in a care facility. I stood up slowly. I buttoned my coat. I did not apologize, and I did not argue. I looked directly at Jada and told her I loved her more than my own life, and that I would always protect her even when she did not want me to. I turned my back on the dining table and walked toward the front hallway. I heard the heavy footsteps of Blake following closely behind me. He told Jada he would see me out and lock the door. I reached for the brass doorknob of the front door. Blake stepped directly into my personal space, completely blocking the exit. He was taller than me, and he used his physical size to try and intimidate me. He leaned his face down, bringing his mouth within an inch of my right ear. The smell of the expensive wine on his breath mixed with the foul stench of his true nature. The fake soothing tone he used with Jada was completely gone. His voice was a flat, dead whisper meant only for me. He told me that I had played my final card and failed miserably. He said that Jada belonged entirely to him now, and she would sign any legal document he put in front of her. He advised me to go home, sit in my armchair, and wait quietly for the end of my miserable life. He then pressed his shoulder hard against mine and whispered one final sentence. He told me that old, confused men living alone in two-story houses are incredibly prone to falling down the stairs and breaking their fragile necks. He smiled a terrifying, hollow smile, reached past me, and pulled the front door wide open. I stepped out into the cold night air without saying a word. I heard the heavy deadbolt slide into place behind me. I walked down the front steps, my mind completely detached from the emotional pain of my daughter's rejection. The grief was gone. Only the cold, calculating engineer remained. Blake had just threatened my life and declared total ownership over my daughter. He thought he had won the psychological war by kicking me out of the house. He had absolutely no idea that I had just finished running the security video through my software before I arrived for dinner, and I already possessed the license plate number of the woman he thought he had successfully silenced. I drove back to my empty house with the sound of Blake's threat echoing in my mind. The temptation to dial the emergency line and report the assault was overwhelming, but I forced my rational mind to suppress the urge. I knew the legal system better than most citizens. I had spent decades designing and installing high-security camera networks for courthouses and police precincts across the state. I knew exactly what a skilled defense attorney would do with that specific security footage. The camera angle was slightly too high, and the violent struggle was partially obscured by the harsh glare of the porch light. Blake was choking her, yes, but he was also standing on his own property in the middle of the night. If I handed that video to the police right now, Blake would simply claim she was a deranged trespasser who attacked him first. He would state he was defending his home and his sleeping fiance. A smooth talker like him would easily spin it into a self-defense narrative. He would post bail before sunrise and immediately accelerate whatever sinister financial plan he had for Jada. I could not risk tipping my hand for a minor assault charge. I needed ironclad proof of his true identity and his actual motive. I needed to find the victim. I walked into my home office and securely locked the heavy oak door behind me. I booted up my primary workstation. The dark room was instantly illuminated by the harsh, cool glow of 3 large monitors. I pulled up the raw encrypted video file I had downloaded from my private server. I scrubbed through the timeline and isolated the few frames where a vehicle was barely visible, idling at the curb in the deep background. The license plate was a blurry, pixelated mess hidden in the shadows of the street lamps. I launched a highly classified image enhancement algorithm I had coded years ago for a military contractor. It utilized predictive pixel generation to sharpen distorted text and correct low-light distortions. I highlighted the rectangular area of the license plate and initiated the rendering process. The progress bar crept forward agonizingly slowly. While the computer fans whirred loudly in the silent room, my eyes drifted to a silver-framed photograph resting on the corner of my desk. It was a picture of my late wife smiling brightly while holding a newborn Jada in her arms. When an aggressive cancer took her from us 10 years ago, I sat holding her fragile hand in the hospice room and made a solemn vow. I promised her I would be the shield that kept our daughter safe from the cruelty of the world. Jada was my entire universe. Her mother's death had left a deep void in her heart, a desperate craving for stability and traditional family life. That was exactly the vulnerability Blake had expertly identified and exploited. He provided the perfect illusion of security. I had spent my entire life building physical walls, biometric locks, and security networks for politicians, but I had failed to see the danger walking right through our front door, disguised as a handsome, charming suitor. Blake thought he could use my grief and my senior age as a convenient weapon against me. He deeply underestimated the dangerous, unstoppable force of a father protecting his only child. A sharp, synthetic beep from the workstation pulled me out of my memories. The algorithm had successfully finished compiling the data. The blurry pixels on the screen had resolved into 7 perfectly clear, high-contrast, alphanumeric characters. It was a standard Georgia state license plate. I opened a secondary, heavily encrypted browser. During my years working alongside federal agencies, I had retained a few quiet, untraceable digital backdoors into the state vehicle registration databases. I typed the characters into the terminal and bypassed the standard firewall. Within 30 seconds, the database returned a definitive match. The car belonged to a woman named Clara Vance. I memorized her listed residential address, but I did not drive to her house. If Blake had violently choked her on his porch and then spent the rest of the night aggressively bleaching the trunk of his sport utility vehicle, Clara Vance was definitely not sitting comfortably on her living room couch. I needed to know where he had dumped her. I accessed the county emergency dispatch logs, running a data scraper tool to filter for severe assault victims' hit-and-run reports or unidentified female trauma admissions within the last 48 hours. The system processed the public police bans and hospital intake registries. A few minutes later, the screen flashed with a matching hit. A woman matching Clara's exact physical description had been found unconscious on the shoulder of a rural county highway late Friday night. The paramedics had initially classified it as a severe hit and run. She was currently admitted to the intensive care unit at the county medical center under a temporary police hold. She had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head and prolonged hypoxia. She was alive, but just barely holding on. I immediately grabbed my heavy coat, my truck keys, and my concealed weapon. The county hospital was a massive, sprawling complex located 20 miles south of the city limits. I navigated the empty midnight highway with cold mechanical precision. When I arrived at the medical center, I did not drive toward the brightly lit main emergency room entrance where the police cruisers were parked. I parked in the adjacent employee parking garage and used a side access door I knew was frequently propped open by exhausted nursing staff taking midnight smoke breaks. I kept my head down, moving with the slow, deliberate shuffle of a tired family member desperately looking for a vending machine. I wore a faded baseball cap pulled low over my eyes to obscure my face from the overhead security cameras. I bypassed the main lobby and took the freight elevator up to the 4th floor intensive care wing. The hallways up here were deathly quiet, bathed in harsh, sterile fluorescent light. The smell of strong antiseptic hung heavily in the air. I checked the digital floor directory glowing on the wall and located the specific corridor where the severe trauma patients were being monitored. I walked silently down the polished linoleum floor, tracking the room numbers counting up toward 412. As I rounded the final corner toward Clara's room, I abruptly stopped and pressed my back flat against the cold, tiled wall. Every single alarm bell in my head started ringing simultaneously. Clara Vance was not alone. There were no uniformed county police officers sitting outside her door, which meant her case was still considered a low-priority, unsolved hit and run by the local authorities. Instead, there were two unfamiliar men standing directly outside her room. They were absolutely not hospital staff or concerned family members. They wore cheap dark suits that fit poorly over their thick muscular frames. One of them had a jagged, angry red scar running down the side of his neck, disappearing into his shirt collar. The other man was casually leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, but his right hand rested suspiciously close to a heavy bulge hidden under his jacket. They were scanning the quiet hallway with the cold, hyper-alert eyes of professional enforcers. My blood ran instantly cold. The reality of the situation crashed down on me with terrifying weight. Blake Montgomery was not just a greedy, manipulative sociopath acting alone to steal a house. He was an active part of a highly organized, dangerous network. They had discovered that Clara Vance had survived the attack, and they had dispatched a professional cleanup crew to the hospital to ensure she never woke up to tell the police what she knew. I was no longer just fighting a terrible son-in-law. I was walking directly into a deadly conspiracy, and these men were standing between me and the only witness who could save my daughter. I backed away from the corner of the hallway with slow, deliberate steps, ensuring the rubber soles of my boots made absolutely no sound against the polished linoleum. I was heavily outnumbered and outgunned. Confronting two professional enforcers outside an intensive care unit would immediately result in my arrest or my death, and neither outcome would save my daughter. I retreated down the corridor and scanned the acoustic ceiling tiles. My eyes traced the exposed conduit wiring running along the upper wall, searching for a vulnerability. I found exactly what I needed right next to the public restrooms. It was a heavy metal access panel for the floor electrical and fire suppression systems. I pulled a flathead screwdriver from my jacket pocket and popped the lock on the panel in 3 seconds flat. I am a master electrician and a systems engineer. I know exactly how commercial fire alarms are wired to operate in isolated zones. I did not want to evacuate the entire hospital and cause a massive panic. I only needed a localized distraction on the 4th floor. I stripped a thick copper wire, bypassed the main breaker, and intentionally crossed the live circuits feeding the smoke detectors directly above Clara Vance's room. A shower of blue sparks erupted inside the metal box. 3 seconds later, the deafening high-pitched shriek of the fire alarm tore through the silent hospital wing. Red strobe lights began flashing violently, painting the white walls in a harsh, bloody glare. Heavy magnetic fire doors at the end of the hallway automatically slammed shut with a loud crash. I peeked around the corner. The sudden noise and flashing lights completely shattered the quiet vigil of the two men in the cheap suits. The man with the neck scar cursed loudly, pulling his hand away from his concealed weapon. The other man looked up at the ceiling in confusion as a robotic voice over the intercom ordered all personnel to evacuate the sector. A team of night shift nurses sprinted down the opposite end of the hall, pushing a heavy medication cart out of the way and yelling for everyone to move toward the emergency stairs. The two enforcers hesitated, exchanging a panicked look. They did not want to be questioned by the fire department or the police. They pulled their suit jackets tight and quickly blended into the chaotic crowd of evacuating medical staff moving hastily toward the exit stairwell. The moment the hallway cleared, I sprinted out of the shadows and slipped directly into room 412. I closed the heavy wooden door behind me and locked the deadbolt. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glowing screens of the cardiac monitors and the flashing red strobe light outside the window. Clara Vance was lying flat on the hospital bed. The sight of her made my chest tighten with a cold, absolute fury. The security camera footage had not captured the full extent of his brutality. Her face was severely swollen and deeply bruised, colored in horrific shades of purple and black. A thick white bandage was wrapped tightly around her neck, securing a breathing tube. Both of her eyes were blackened, but they snapped open the second I locked the door. Pure, unfiltered terror washed over her face. She thought I was one of the men sent to finish the job. She weakly raised her hands, trembling violently, and tried to scream, but only a wet, ragged gasp escaped her damaged throat. Her heart rate monitor began to beep frantically. I rushed to the side of her bed and kept my hands clearly visible. I leaned down and spoke in a low, urgent whisper. I told her I was not there to hurt her. I told her my name was Nathaniel Hayes. I pulled the twisted, broken black glasses frame from my pocket and held it up to the dim light. I told her I watched a man named Blake Montgomery choke her on my daughter's front porch, and I needed to know exactly why she was carrying a folder with my old construction company logo on it. Clara stopped thrashing, her swollen eyes fixed on the broken glasses in my hand. Her breathing slowed down, but the fear in her expression was quickly replaced by a profound, agonizing sorrow. She reached up with a shaking hand and weakly pulled the oxygen mask down from her face. When she spoke, her voice was a painful, raspy whisper that sounded like crushed glass. She told me that his name was not Blake Montgomery. She said that was just the current costume he was wearing. She struggled for breath, gripping the edge of the bed rail. She confessed that she used to be his accomplice, his administrative assistant in a highly organized and incredibly ruthless criminal ring. She told me that the man sleeping in my daughter's house was a career predator. He specifically hunted wealthy, successful African-American families. He targeted brilliant women who were emotionally vulnerable women who had lost a parent and desperately wanted to build a perfect family. He would mirror their desires, charm his way into their homes, isolate them from their protective fathers or siblings, and then systematically drain every single asset they owned. My blood turned to ice. I asked her about the folder she dropped on the porch. Clara let out a bitter, painful cough. She explained that the folder contained a stack of heavily forged legal documents. It included irrevocable trust transfers, massive life insurance policy adjustments, and a comprehensive power of attorney agreement. He had used my old company logo to forge a fake commercial real estate investment portfolio, tricking Jada into signing away the deed to her new house under the guise of a tax write-off. Clara told me that the moment Jada signed the official marriage certificate, Blake would legally own absolutely everything my daughter had worked her entire life to build. And once he secured the money, he would ensure Jada suffered a tragic, fatal accident. Clara had tried to back out of the syndicate because she could no longer stomach the body count. She had stolen the master folder to use as leverage, threatening to expose him to Jada if he did not pay her to disappear. Instead of paying her, he dragged her to the porch and tried to snap her neck. I stood frozen beside the hospital bed, absorbing the full, terrifying reality of the monster living with my child. He was not just a gold digger, he was a financial assassin. Suddenly, the fire alarm in the hallway abruptly cut off. The harsh red strobe lights stopped flashing. The heavy silence that followed was instantly broken by the sound of authoritative footsteps and jangling keys approaching the locked door. The hospital security team was clearing the rooms. We were completely out of time. Clara reached a trembling hand under her hospital gown. She fumbled with the tape holding her bandages in place and pulled out a small metallic USB flash drive. She had taped it directly to her ribs to hide it from the nurses. She pressed the warm metal into my palm. She told me that drive contained the digital blueprints of his entire operation. It held the offshore bank account, routing numbers, the forged signatures, and the real identities of the men waiting in the hallway. She begged me to take it to the federal authorities and burn his entire life to the ground. Someone grabbed the exterior door handle and rattled it violently. A man shouted through the heavy wood, demanding to know who had locked the patient door. I slipped the flash drive deep into my pocket. I looked at Clara, gave her a single firm nod of profound gratitude, and moved silently toward the bathroom. I locked the bathroom door behind me, climbed up onto the toilet seat, and forcefully kicked out the reinforced ventilation screen set high in the wall. I pulled my body through the narrow opening just as I heard the main hospital door burst open behind me. I crawled through the dusty, cramped maintenance shaft, navigating by the dim light of my cell phone, until I found a drop panel leading directly into the adjacent utility stairwell. I dropped down onto the concrete landing, brushed the heavy layer of industrial dust off my jacket, and began a rapid, silent descent toward the parking garage. My mind was operating at 1,000 miles an hour. I now possessed the weapon required to destroy him. I just needed to get to my computer, decrypt the flash drive, and hand the entire package over to my lawyer to initiate a federal freeze on all his assets. I reached the bottom floor and pushed the heavy metal exit door open, stepping out into the cool, damp air of the parking garage. Before I could even take a step toward my truck, my cell phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was Jada. I answered the call, keeping my voice perfectly steady and calm despite the adrenaline raging through my veins. I expected her to still be angry about the dinner argument. I expected her to demand another apology. Instead, her voice was breathless, excited, and completely intoxicated by the lies of the predator sleeping next to her. She did not bring up the broken glasses. She did not mention my supposed paranoia. She told me that she and Blake had just had a long, deeply emotional conversation. She said Blake was incredibly forgiving and understood that my recent behavior was just a father struggling to let go of his little girl. She said they both agreed that life was too short to wait and that drawing out the wedding planning was only causing unnecessary family tension. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still in the empty concrete garage. Jada took a deep breath and delivered the sentence that completely destroyed my timeline. She enthusiastically announced that they were canceling the large venue booking. They were not going to wait another 6 months. They had decided to move the wedding up to this coming Sunday. They were going to sign the legal marriage certificate in exactly 5 days. The line went dead. He was accelerating the timeline. He knew I was getting too close and he was moving in for the kill. The line went dead, leaving me standing in the cold concrete parking garage with the terrifying echo of her excitement ringing in my ears. 5 days. The monster sleeping in her bed was not just accelerating his timeline out of impatience. He was reacting to me. He knew I was asking the right questions, checking the wrong spaces, and getting entirely too close to his carefully constructed facade. He realized the wedding was the only legal barrier standing between him and absolute control over my daughter life, and he was rushing to cross that finish line before I could expose him. I climbed into my truck and locked the doors. I pulled the small metallic flash drive Clara had given me from my pocket. It felt heavier than a loaded weapon. I did not drive to the local police precinct. I drove straight back to my secure home office. I needed to see exactly what kind of explosive material I was holding before I initiated a legal strike. I booted up my primary workstation, completely bypassed my standard operating system, and launched a secure offline decryption environment. I plugged the flash drive into the terminal. Clara had not exaggerated. The drive contained gigabytes of meticulously organized digital records. It was a comprehensive masterclass in financial destruction. I clicked through encrypted spreadsheets detailing offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, and Cyprus. I found high-resolution scans of forged notary stamps, fake corporate tax returns, and a terrifyingly long list of previous victims. But I did not care about his past crimes right now. I needed to find his current operation. I opened a folder labeled with Jada's initials. The contents of that specific folder made my stomach violently churn. There were copies of the deed to her new house manipulated with fake addendums. There were forged signatures on investment portfolio transfers. But the most horrifying document was a freshly digitized legal form. I printed it out, grabbed my secure phone, and immediately dialed the private cell phone number of Richard Pierce. Richard Pierce was not just a family lawyer. He was a ruthless, highly connected corporate attorney who specialized in dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. He also owed his entire career to me after I helped clear his father name in a massive federal contracting scandal 20 years ago. When Richard answered the phone, his voice was thick with sleep, but the sheer urgency in my tone woke him up instantly. I told him to turn on his encrypted fax machine and receive the document I was sending. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in my silent office listening to Richard pacing back and forth across his own study on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with genuine legal panic. He told me the document I sent him was a comprehensively executed durable power of attorney combined with a total medical directive. It was already fully signed, legally witnessed, and officially notarized by someone inside Blake's criminal network. Richard explained the terrifying reality of what I was looking at. He stated that Blake had already convinced Jada to sign away her fundamental human rights under the guise of emergency wedding preparation. Richard broke down the legal terminology into cold, hard facts. He told me that if Jada were to suffer a sudden tragic accident tomorrow morning, Blake would instantly possess absolute control over her entire medical care. He could legally block me from entering her hospital room. He could authorize the withdrawal of life support. And because of the financial clauses buried in the fine print, he would immediately absorb every single asset she owned, even if the marriage certificate had not yet been signed. The wedding was just the final public performance to solidify the theft. The trap was already completely set, and my daughter was standing right on the trigger. Richard urgently advised me to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation right this second. He said we had enough digital evidence to secure a warrant for wire fraud and identity theft. I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk. I told Richard exactly why I could not involve the authorities tonight. Jada was currently asleep in the same bed as a man who had just brutally choked a woman for threatening his plan. If a squad of federal agents kicked down their front door at 3 o'clock in the morning, Blake would instantly realize his operation was burned. A cornered predator is the most dangerous kind. He might take Jada hostage. He might panic and hurt her in the crossfire. Or worse, he might use his network of enforcers to silence her before he disappeared. I told Richard that saving Jada required a surgical extraction, not a chaotic raid. We needed to freeze Blake in his tracks. We needed to give him a reason to keep Jada perfectly safe and healthy for the next 5 days. I needed to hijack his greed and use it as a highly effective leash. Richard remained silent for a long moment, processing the tactical reality of the situation. He finally agreed, but he warned me that we were playing an incredibly dangerous game of Russian roulette with Jada's life. He asked me what the strategy was. He wanted to know how we were going to stall a professional con artist who was already accelerating his exit strategy. I told Richard that a parasite only detached from its host when it found a much larger, wealthier target. Blake thought he was stealing a beautiful house and a surgeon bank account. He thought I was just a retired old man living on a modest fixed pension. He had absolutely no idea about the massive, irrevocable family trust I had built after selling my construction empire. I told Richard to immediately begin drafting a heavily loaded financial transfer agreement. I wanted a legally binding document that looked exactly like a massive unconditional monetary gift, but was actually wired with federal tracking traps and required Blake to sign his real physical signature alongside his fraudulent alias. Richard warned me that exposing my own wealth would paint a massive target directly on my back. I told him I welcomed the crosshairs. I would gladly let Blake hunt me if it meant he took his eyes off my daughter. I hung up the phone with Richard. The digital clock on my desk read 4:15 in the morning. The sky outside my window was still pitch black. I picked up my cell phone and opened my text message conversation with Blake. I did not write a long emotional paragraph. I needed to sound like a defeated, exhausted old man who had finally realized he had lost the battle for his daughter's loyalty. I needed to stroke his massive, fragile ego perfectly. I stared at the glowing screen and typed the message with slow, deliberate keystrokes. I wrote that I had spent the entire night thinking about my terrible behavior at dinner. I told him Jada was right and that my stubborn pride and old age were clouding my judgment. I stated that I was deeply sorry for questioning his character and making a scene about the broken garbage in the driveway. I typed that my only desire in this world was to see my little girl happy and financially secure. I took a deep breath, steadying my hands, and typed the final fatal sentence. I told him that I completely agreed with moving the wedding up to this Sunday. I wrote that to prove my genuine acceptance of him joining our family, I was going to contact my bank in the morning. I stated that I would personally transfer $2 million into their joint account as an early wedding gift provided he met with me privately to sign the official bank release forms. I hit send. The message disappeared into the cellular network. I placed the phone face up on the desk and waited. I knew a predator like him never truly slept. He was always calculating, always guarding his lies. Less than 3 minutes later, the screen illuminated the dark room. A new message from Blake appeared. He wrote a sickeningly polite reply thanking me for my profound understanding and gracious generosity. He stated he would be absolutely honored to meet with me privately to handle the paperwork. I leaned back in my leather chair. The bait was set. The hook was deeply embedded in his greed. He would not harm Jada now. He would keep her perfectly safe until Sunday because he wanted that $2 million more than he wanted anything else in the world. He thought he was about to execute the greatest financial heist of his pathetic life. He did not know he had just scheduled an appointment for his own absolute destruction. The sun rose over Atlanta, casting long shadows across my silent living room. I had not slept a single minute. Richard Pierce delivered the heavily booby-trapped financial documents via a private bonded courier at exactly 7 in the morning. I spent the next hour reviewing every single line of the contract. Richard was a legal genius. On the surface, the paperwork looked like a standard irrevocable transfer of $2 million from my private trust into a joint account controlled by Blake. But buried deep within the archaic legal jargon and tax liability clauses was a binding admission of financial receipt that waived his right to arbitration in the event of federal fraud charges. It was a golden bear trap wrapped in a velvet ribbon. I placed the documents inside a dark leather folder and centered it perfectly on my mahogany desk. I also knew that the bait had worked exactly as intended. I had checked the hospital police scanner feeds while waiting for the courier. The two men lurking outside Clara Vance's room had completely vanished. Blake had called off his attack dogs. His bottomless greed had overridden his survival instinct. He could not risk a messy hospital assassination drawing police attention while he was mere hours away from securing a massive payday. He needed me alive, calm, and cooperative to sign those bank releases. He thought he was managing the situation perfectly. He thought he was playing me like a cheap violin. At precisely 9:00, Blake's silver sport utility vehicle pulled into my driveway. I watched him through the security monitors. The car was immaculately clean, showing no signs of the chemical bleach he had scrubbed into the trunk just 2 nights prior. He stepped out wearing a sharp navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. He looked like the absolute picture of a successful, reliable family man. He walked up my front steps with a confident, arrogant bounce in his stride. He honestly believed he had emotionally broken me at dinner, and now he was arriving to collect his ultimate prize. I opened the front door before he could even press the doorbell. He immediately extended his right hand, flashing that practiced, hollow smile. I took his hand. His grip was intentionally firm, a pathetic physical attempt to establish dominance in my own home. I kept my expression entirely defeated, letting my shoulders slump slightly to play the part of the tired, broken father. I invited him inside and led him directly back to my home office. I offered him a seat in the leather guest chair positioned directly across from my desk. He sat down, unbuttoning his suit jacket and crossing his legs casually. He looked around my office, his eyes lingering on the expensive artwork and the antique bookshelves. I could practically see the calculator running behind his pale blue eyes, adding up the total net worth of my estate. He was salivating at the thought of draining me dry once he finished with Jada. We began the conversation with a sickening display of false pleasantries. Blake leaned forward and spoke in a hushed, respectful tone. He told me again how much he appreciated my sudden change of heart. He claimed that Jada was overjoyed when he shared the news of my blessing. He looked me right in the eyes and said he knew it was incredibly difficult for a father to hand over the responsibility of protecting his daughter to another man. He promised me he would take care of Jada exactly the way she deserved to be taken care of. The hidden double meaning in his words was entirely intentional. He was openly mocking me, rubbing his perceived victory directly in my face while sitting in my own chair. I swallowed my absolute disgust and played my part flawlessly. I told him my only concern was her future stability. I pushed the dark leather folder across the polished mahogany wood. I told him that the $2 million was just the beginning. I lied smoothly, hinting that my overall estate was significantly larger than Jada even realized, and that I was looking for a capable man to manage my private assets as my health inevitably declined. I watched his pupils physically dilate. The sheer magnitude of his greed blinded him completely. He opened the folder and stared at the certified bank draft authorization. He pulled a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen from his inside breast pocket. He did not ask to have his own lawyer review the paperwork. He did not read the dense paragraphs of legal stipulations hidden on the second page. His arrogance convinced him that a retired grieving engineer could never outsmart a professional financial con artist. He saw the number 2 followed by 6 zeros, and his critical thinking completely shut down. He asked me where he needed to sign. I pointed to the 3 designated lines at the bottom of the final page. The room was dead silent except for the sharp, scratchy sound of the gold fountain pen gliding across the thick paper. He signed his alias, Blake Montgomery, with a massive flourish. He then initialed the margins exactly as Richard had instructed. He pushed the folder back across the desk toward me, closed his pen, and offered me another bright, predatory smile. He told me I had made the smartest investment of my entire life. I looked down at his fresh signature, nodded slowly, and told him I completely agreed. I stood up and walked him back to the front door. We shook hands one final time. He told me he would see me at the wedding rehearsal dinner on Saturday night. I watched him walk back to his car, completely drunk on his own perceived brilliance. He drove away truly believing he was about to steal my daughter and my fortune in a single weekend. I locked the front door, turned around, and walked straight back into my office. I took the freshly signed document out of the leather folder. I turned on my high-resolution optical scanner and placed the contract face down on the glass. I connected the scanner directly to my secure workstation and uploaded the digital image of his signature into the decryption environment I had built last night. I opened the encrypted flash drive Clara had given me at the hospital. I accessed the federal database files containing the forged signatures from his previous scams across 3 different states. Professional criminals constantly change their names, their social security numbers, and their faces. But handwriting is entirely biometric. The muscle memory required to loop specific letters, the exact angle of the pen strokes, and the varying pressure applied to the paper are almost impossible to perfectly disguise when writing quickly. I ran his fresh signature through a forensic graphology comparative software I had acquired years ago. The progress bar flashed rapidly across my monitor. 5 seconds later, the screen lit up bright green. It was an absolute 100% biometric match. He had signed the fake name Blake Montgomery, but the underlying pen strokes perfectly matched a federal fugitive wanted for wire fraud, identity theft, and extortion in multiple jurisdictions. He thought he had just signed a receipt to receive $2 million. He did not know he had just willingly provided the federal government with his own ironclad death warrant. I sat in the cold blue glow of my computer monitors staring at the biometric match that confirmed Blake was a federal fugitive. I had the weapon I needed to destroy his freedom, but a seasoned predator like him did not just stumble blindly onto a wealthy, isolated target. He needed a map. He needed someone on the inside who knew exactly where the money was buried. I navigated back to the root directory of the encrypted flash drive Clara had risked her life to give me. I bypassed the folders containing his fake identities and offshore accounts looking for the origin point of his operation. I found a subfolder cryptically labeled with the corporate acronym of my primary financial institution. My hands hovered over the mechanical keyboard for a fraction of a second before I clicked it open. Inside was a meticulously organized ledger detailing incoming wire transfers to Blake from a domestic routing number. I ran a quick trace program using my network security tools. The IP address pinged directly to the executive wealth management floor of my own bank. I opened an audio subfolder and clicked on a highly compressed voice file. The metadata indicated it was recorded 8 months ago, a full 2 months before Jada even met the man who would try to ruin her life. The audio was a clear recording of a private phone call. I recognized the first voice instantly. It was the smooth, oily, confident tone of Blake. But the second voice made my stomach drop and the blood pound fiercely in my ears. It was Simon. Simon was the senior trust director at my bank. I had known him for 15 years. I had trusted him implicitly. I had attended his daughter's college graduation party and bought him expensive cigars at Christmas. He was the man legally tasked with safeguarding the Hayes family legacy. On the recording, Simon let out a greedy, pathetic laugh. He explicitly detailed the exact structure of Jada's trust fund. He read aloud her total net worth, her annual income, and the specific clauses regarding her inheritance. Worse than the financial betrayal was the emotional violation. Simon casually described Jada as a prime asset. He told Blake that she was brilliant but lonely, still grieving the loss of her mother and desperate for a traditional family structure. Simon sold my daughter's psychological profile to a monster in exchange for a guaranteed 15% cut of the final payout. The cold calculating engineer inside my mind took complete control. I did not call Richard Pierce. I did not involve the authorities. I shut down my computer, grabbed my heavy wool jacket, and drove straight to the downtown financial district. The bank lobby was a pristine monument to institutional wealth. It smelled of polished marble, expensive espresso, and quiet privilege. I walked past the mahogany reception desk, completely ignoring the young administrative assistant who asked if I had a scheduled appointment. I marched down the executive corridor and pushed open the heavy glass door to Simon Corner office. He was sitting behind his massive oak desk, typing on his computer and sipping coffee from a porcelain cup. He looked up, momentarily startled by the intrusion, but his years of corporate training immediately kicked in. He plastered on a warm, professional smile. He stood up, smoothed his expensive silk tie, and called me his favorite client. He asked how the wedding preparations were going and offered me a sparkling water. I did not shake his hand. I walked around his desk, pulled the heavy privacy blind shut on his glass walls, and locked the solid wooden door until the deadbolt clicked loudly into place. Simon's smile faltered. His eyes darted nervously from the locked door to my face. He asked me if something was wrong with my accounts. I did not say a single word. I pulled my secure cell phone from my jacket pocket, placed it directly on his polished desk, and hit play. The audio of him selling my daughter echoed sharply in the quiet, soundproofed office. The color instantly and completely drained from Simon's face. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that his porcelain coffee cup rattled against its saucer. He lunged forward to grab the phone, but I slammed my hand down on his wrist, pinning his arm to the desk with a force that made him gasp in pain. I leaned over the desk, invading his physical space. I looked directly into his terrified eyes. I told him I had the digital paper trail of his offshore kickbacks. I told him I had the forged signatures he had illegally notarized to transfer Jada property. I promised him that if I walked out of this office and handed the flash drive to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he would lose his pension, his reputation, his family, and he would spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. Simon completely shattered. The arrogant, untouchable banker facade dissolved into pathetic fear. His knees buckled, and he collapsed heavily into his expensive leather chair. He covered his face with his trembling hands and began to weep. He begged me not to ruin his life. He babbled useless excuses about bad investments, gambling debts, and how Blake had pressured him into the arrangement. I slammed my fist against the desk, cutting off his pathetic tears. I told him his apologies meant absolutely nothing to me. I demanded to know every single detail of what Blake was planning. I told him this was his one and only chance to buy my silence. Simon gasped for air, wiping his sweating forehead with his sleeve. He looked up at me with sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes. He desperately offered a piece of information he swore was not documented in any of the digital files. He told me that the real estate fraud and the trust fund theft were just the initial phases of the operation. He said Blake had forced him to expedite a massive, highly irregular insurance policy just 2 days ago. It was a $5 million comprehensive accidental death and dismemberment policy written entirely on Jada. My heart stopped beating for a second. The air in the room suddenly felt freezing cold. I asked him for the specific details of the policy. Simon swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He explained that because of the massive payout amount, the policy required a mandatory waiting period and an expedited medical underwriter review. Blake had forged the medical records to push it through the system. Simon looked me right in the eyes and delivered the fatal blow. He told me that the life insurance policy officially went into active binding effect this coming Sunday night at exactly midnight. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with horrifying clarity. Blake accelerating the wedding to Sunday was not just about securing the marriage certificate to control her assets. He needed to be her legal next of kin the exact moment the insurance policy activated. The wedding was never the finish line. Sunday night was the scheduled execution. He planned to kill my daughter on her wedding night, claim it was a tragic accident, and walk away with over $10 million in stolen assets and insurance payouts. I picked up my phone, put it back in my pocket, and unlocked his office door. I told Simon that if he attempted to warn Blake, or if he tried to flee the city, I would release the audio file to the authorities and the media within 60 seconds. I left him sitting in his dark office, completely paralyzed by fear. I walked out of the bank and into the bright city sunlight. The clock was ticking, and I had exactly 48 hours to prepare for a war. I drove back to my house with the chilling reality of Simon's confession burning in my mind. 48 hours. That was the exact amount of time I had left to save my daughter from a meticulously planned execution. As soon as I walked through my front door, I pulled out my phone and dialed Jada's personal number. I needed to hear her voice. I needed to invent a medical emergency to bring her back to the city immediately. The call rang exactly once before going straight to a generic automated voicemail. I tried her hospital pager next. The automated system simply informed me that Dr. Hayes was officially on leave until Monday morning. I walked rapidly into my home office and accessed the secure server where I had secretly mirrored her home network data. I scanned her recent digital footprint, searching frantically for any indication of her current location. I dug through her digital trash folder and found a confirmed reservation email sent to her inbox earlier that morning. Blake had booked a private off-the-grid rental cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains of North Georgia. The email proudly advertised the property as a romantic, secluded getaway with absolutely no cellular reception and zero internet access. He had clearly pitched it to Jada as the perfect quiet weekend to disconnect and relax before their rushed Sunday wedding. I knew the terrifying truth. He was intentionally isolating her in a remote, rugged location where nobody could hear her scream, and where the police response time was measured in hours, not minutes. Calling the local county sheriff to request a wellness check was completely out of the question. A marked police cruiser slowly navigating those steep mountain dirt roads would give Blake a massive advanced warning. If he saw blue flashing lights approaching the cabin, he would simply push her down a steep ravine, claim she slipped while taking a romantic hike, and play the role of the devastated weeping fiance. He would trigger the insurance payout early and disappear before the local deputies even finished writing their preliminary incident report. I could not rely on the slow bureaucratic machinery of the law to save my child. This situation required a direct surgical intervention. I left my office and walked down the wooden stairs into the unfinished section of my basement. The air down here was cool and smelled faintly of damp earth and old concrete. I walked past the neat rows of cardboard storage boxes and approached a heavy olive-drab steel footlocker pushed into the far dark corner. I wiped a thick layer of dust off the heavy brass padlock and entered the combination. The lock clicked open heavily. I threw open the metal lid. Inside lay the physical remnants of a life I had left behind decades ago. Long before I designed corporate security systems, I served as a combat engineer in the United States Army. My entire military career was spent building temporary bridges under heavy enemy fire, disarming complex explosive devices, and conducting surgical extraction missions in highly hostile environments. Blake Montgomery looked at my gray hair and my wrinkled hands and saw a weak, obsolete old man waiting for a nursing home. He did not understand that the wrinkles were earned in blood, and the gray hair hid a mind trained to dismantle entire enemy camps piece by piece. I was no longer playing the role of the grieving, polite father. I was a soldier preparing for a rescue mission. I bypassed my old faded uniforms and reached directly for the heavy tactical equipment. I pulled out a custom-built wide-spectrum radio frequency jammer. It was roughly the size of a thick paperback book housed in a durable black casing. If Blake had a satellite phone or a concealed two-way radio to communicate with his team of professional enforcers, this device would create a massive electronic dead zone within a 1-mile radius. I checked the lithium battery pack and secured the heavy jammer to a thick tactical belt. Next, I packed half a dozen thick industrial zip ties, a military-grade trauma medical kit, and a high-lumen tactical flashlight capable of blinding a man in total darkness. Finally, I reached deep into the bottom of the footlocker and retrieved my primary sidearm. It was a heavy-caliber semi-automatic pistol maintained in absolutely pristine condition. The familiar metallic smell of carbon and gun oil filled the basement air. I loaded 3 extended magazines with hollow-point ammunition chambered around with a sharp, echoing clack and holstered the weapon tightly at my hip. I spent the rest of Friday night and the entire day Saturday reviewing the detailed topographical maps of the North Georgia mountain range. I memorized the elevation changes, the blind curves, and the dead-end logging roads surrounding the rental cabin coordinates. I needed to know the physical terrain better than the predator hiding inside it. By Saturday evening, the heavy, suffocating humidity in the Atlanta air finally broke. A massive, violent thunderstorm rolled across the state, bringing torrential rain, high winds, and severe lightning. It was the absolute perfect cover for an undetected infiltration. I loaded my gear into my heavy-duty truck and began the long drive north. The smooth highway quickly disappeared, replaced by winding, treacherous mountain roads. The rain lashed furiously against my windshield, the wiper blades struggling to clear the sheer volume of water. Thunder rattled the heavy steel chassis of my truck. The darkness outside was absolute, punctuated only by jagged flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the dense, towering pine trees. The hazardous weather conditions slowed my progress significantly, but I did not touch the brakes. The digital clock on my dashboard read 11:45 at night. Sunday was officially arriving. The insurance policy countdown was entering its final lethal phase. After 3 grueling hours of navigating washed-out dirt roads and dangerously steep inclines, my GPS system indicated I was exactly 1 mile away from the target coordinates. I pulled my truck entirely off the main logging path and hid it behind a thick cluster of massive evergreen trees. I killed the engine and the headlights. I stepped out of the vehicle into the freezing torrential downpour. I secured my tactical belt, flipped the switch on the signal jammer, and drew my weapon. I walked the final mile on foot, moving silently through the thick mud and heavy brush, keeping the dirt road in my sight but remaining completely hidden deep in the tree line. The freezing rain soaked straight through my heavy jacket, chilling me completely to the bone, but my mental focus remained razor sharp. Through the dense curtain of falling water, I finally spotted the structure. It was a large, two-story wooden cabin built directly into the side of a steep rocky incline. The property was completely surrounded by deep, unforgiving woods. I crouched low behind a massive oak tree and surveyed the perimeter. Blake's silver sport utility vehicle was parked haphazardly in the gravel driveway, reflecting the occasional bright flash of lightning. The vehicle was here, which meant they had not left the mountain. I slowly scanned the exterior of the cabin, looking for any movement in the windows or any signs of his hired enforcers standing guard on the porch. The cabin was completely dark. There were absolutely no lights on inside. But as a bright fork of lightning ripped aggressively across the black sky, I saw something that made my heart completely stop. The heavy wooden front door of the cabin was not closed. It was hanging wide open, swinging violently on its metal hinges, slamming repeatedly against the exterior doorframe in the howling mountain wind. A seasoned predator like Blake would never leave his primary entry point unsecured in the middle of a severe thunderstorm, especially when he was holding a captive target. I broke my cover and sprinted across the muddy driveway, my weapon raised and ready to fire. I pressed my back against the wet exterior log wall right next to the open doorway. I sliced the pie, sweeping my gun barrel into the dark interior before stepping fully over the wooden threshold. I clicked on my tactical flashlight, casting a brilliant, blinding white beam into the living room. The interior of the cabin was in a state of absolute, violent chaos. A heavy wooden coffee table was flipped completely upside down. A ceramic table lamp was shattered across the floor, its glass shards glinting brightly in the beam of my light. The thick area rug was kicked up and severely wrinkled, indicating a massive physical struggle had just taken place. I moved rapidly through the first floor, clearing the kitchen and the dining area with military precision. I swept the beam of my light across the hardwood floor and found Jada's cell phone. The screen was completely pulverized, shattered into 100 pieces by the heavy heel of a man boot. She had realized the danger. She had tried to call for help, and he had stopped her. I yelled Jada's name over the deafening sound of the rain outside. I received no answer. I climbed the wooden stairs to the second floor, my boots leaving muddy tracks on the carpet. I kicked open the master bedroom door, sweeping the room with my weapon. The bed was unmade, but the room was entirely empty. I stood in the center of the dark, ruined cabin, the cold wind howling fiercely through the open front door downstairs. The tactical advantage I thought I had was completely gone. The silver vehicle was still sitting in the driveway, but Blake was not here. And more importantly, my daughter was gone. I stood in the center of the dark, ruined master bedroom, my weapon raised and my senses strained to their absolute limits. The cold mountain wind howled violently through the broken window downstairs, masking any subtle sounds of movement within the cabin. I slowly backed out of the room, keeping my gun leveled at the pitch-black hallway. I needed to clear the remaining upstairs rooms. If his silver vehicle was parked in the driveway, he had to be on the property. My mind raced through the tactical possibilities. Perhaps he had dragged Jada into the surrounding woods to execute her. Perhaps he was waiting in the tree line. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the landing of the wooden staircase. I never saw him move. The blinding flash of blue electrical current erupted from the deep shadows of the adjacent bathroom just as a massive crack of thunder shook the cabin walls. 2 barbed metal darts slammed into the thick fabric of my jacket, penetrating the material and burying themselves deep into the muscle of my left shoulder. The agonizing shockwave of 50,000 volts of electricity tore instantly through my entire nervous system. My muscles locked in a violent, uncontrollable spasm. The pistol slipped from my paralyzed fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. I collapsed heavily, my knees slamming into the wood, completely unable to breathe or command my own limbs. A heavy leather boot stepped out of the darkness and viciously kicked my weapon down the stairs. It tumbled end over end, disappearing into the dark living room below. Blake Montgomery stepped fully into the dim light bleeding in from the hallway window. He was not wearing his tailored suits or his expensive cashmere sweaters. He wore dark utilitarian clothing and thick leather gloves. The charming, polite mask he wore for my daughter was completely gone, replaced by a cold, arrogant sneer that twisted his features into something truly demonic. He looked down at me, holding a high-powered military-grade stun gun in his right hand. I gasped desperately for air, my heart hammering a dangerous, erratic rhythm against my ribs as the electrical current finally stopped. I tried to push myself up off the floor, but Blake drove the heavy heel of his boot squarely into the center of my back, pinning me flat against the wooden planks. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed terribly over the sound of the raging storm outside. He reached down, grabbed both of my wrists with terrifying strength, and violently wrenched my arms behind my back. I felt the cold, sharp bite of thick industrial zip ties tightening brutally around my wrists, cutting off the circulation to my hands. He dragged me across the floor and roughly propped me up against the heavy wooden frame of the hallway wall. He crouched down, bringing his face inches from mine. He reached into my tactical belt, unclipped the heavy radio frequency jammer I had brought, and examined it with a look of mild amusement. He pressed the power button, disabling the device, and tossed it casually over his shoulder. He told me I was remarkably predictable for an old man. He said he knew the moment he accelerated the wedding timeline, my protective paranoia would force me to make a desperate move. He had intentionally left the cabin door swinging open in the wind. He had deliberately staged the flipped furniture in the living room. He knew my military background would compel me to enter the structure and clear the rooms, walking blindly into a fatal funnel. He had simply waited in the dark, watching me creep around his trap like a foolish, overconfident mouse. I stared at him, fighting through the lingering paralysis in my chest. I demanded to know where Jada was. Blake stood up casually, wiping the dust off his dark trousers. He began to pace back and forth across the narrow hallway, taking immense pleasure in his apparent victory. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He told me he was entirely exhausted from pretending to tolerate my family. He described the sheer agonizing boredom of sitting at my dining room table, drinking my cheap bourbon, and listening to my pathetic stories. He spoke about Jada with a chilling, detached cruelty. He called her an easy, desperate mark. He said she was so blinded by her grief for her dead mother and so hungry for a picture-perfect marriage that she practically handed him the keys to her entire financial portfolio on their very first date. He mocked her intelligence, stating that a brilliant trauma surgeon was incredibly stupid when it came to understanding how the real world operated. I pulled against the thick plastic restraints binding my wrists, ignoring the sharp pain as the plastic sliced into my skin. I told him he would never live to spend a single dime of my money or hers. Blake stopped pacing and smiled a terrifying, predatory smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black satellite phone. He told me that my money was already perfectly secured. He explained that Jada had actually discovered the truth earlier this evening. She had found a burner phone in his luggage and saw a text message from Simon regarding the expedited life insurance policy. She had panicked, grabbed her keys, and managed to flee the cabin before he could physically restrain her. He leaned close to my face again, his eyes wide with manic excitement. He whispered that her escape was actually the absolute best thing that could have happened for his plan. If she died inside the cabin, the insurance investigators might ask difficult questions. But dying in a violent car crash on a flooded, treacherous mountain road in the middle of a massive thunderstorm was the perfect, unquestionable tragedy. He told me that his specialized cleanup crew had been waiting at the base of the mountain all night. They were currently tracking her vehicle right now. He stepped back and looked at the glowing screen of his satellite phone. He dialed a short sequence of numbers and placed the phone to his ear. The signal bypassed the dead cellular towers and connected instantly to his men. I sat helpless on the floor, the blood roaring in my ears, forced to listen to the final fatal command. Blake spoke into the receiver with a cold, businesslike precision. He told the men on the other end of the line that the old man was fully neutralized and secured inside the cabin. He then gave the exact order that made my entire world shatter into pieces. He said to take care of the girl immediately. He instructed them to run her off the cliff and make it look exactly like a tragic rollover accident. He ordered them to confirm the kill the moment her vehicle hit the bottom of the ravine. He hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with total triumph. He told me he was going to leave me tied up in this cabin while he drove down to the crash site to play the role of the devastated, weeping fiancé for the local police. He promised to come back for me later to ensure I suffered a similar unfortunate accident. He turned his back on me and walked confidently down the wooden stairs, his heavy boots thudding against the steps. A moment later, I heard the front door slam shut. The powerful engine of his silver vehicle roared to life in the driveway, its tires spinning aggressively in the mud as he sped away into the storm. I was left completely alone in the freezing, dark hallway. My daughter was alone out there on the treacherous, rain-slicked highway, desperately fleeing for her life, entirely unaware that a team of professional killers in a heavy truck was closing in on her bumper. I had failed to protect her. I had walked right into a trap, and now Jada was about to pay the ultimate price for my arrogance. The clock had run out. The sound of Blake's engine faded into the howling storm, leaving me sitting on the cold hardwood floor. But the silence inside the cabin did not last long. The heavy front door, which had been swinging wildly in the wind, was suddenly caught and pushed wide open. Heavy, muddy boots stepped over the wooden threshold. The bright beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness of the living room and swept slowly up the staircase. Blake had not left me completely unattended. He was far too careful for that. The man who walked up the stairs and stood over me was one of the professional enforcers I had seen guarding Clara Vance at the hospital. He was the heavy-set man with the angry red scar running down his neck. He held a suppressed pistol in his hand, looking down at me with supreme boredom. Blake had ordered him to stay behind and ensure I did not go anywhere before he returned to finish the job. The guard dragged a wooden chair from the wrecked master bedroom, planted it right in the middle of the hallway, and sat down facing me. He rested his gun on his knee, pulled out his cell phone, and began scrolling through the screen, entirely unconcerned by the old man tied up on the floor. He underestimated me exactly like his boss did. When I prepared for this extraction mission in my basement, I did not just pack a gun and a radio jammer. I am a combat engineer. I always build redundancies into my survival plans. Before I left my house in Atlanta, I had carefully removed a razor-sharp triangular shard of glass from Clara's broken spectacles. I had wrapped the blunt base in thick electrical tape and slipped it deep into the reinforced canvas cuff of my left jacket sleeve. It was a crude, invisible weapon, and it was resting less than 2 inches from my bound fingers. I shifted my weight against the wooden wall, pretending to groan in agony from the lingering effects of the stun gun. The guard did not even look up from his screen. Under the cover of the darkness and the roaring thunder outside, I twisted my left wrist. The thick plastic zip ties bit brutally into my skin, cutting off the circulation and making my fingers feel like heavy blocks of ice. I ignored the agonizing pain. I contorted my hand, reaching blindly into the cuff of my jacket until the tip of my index finger brushed against the taped glass shard. I carefully slid it down into my palm. I maneuvered the sharp edge against the thickest part of the plastic restraint. I began to saw back and forth. The process was painstakingly slow and incredibly dangerous. The glass sliced into my own flesh repeatedly. Hot blood trickled down my hands, making the shard incredibly slippery, but the physical pain meant absolutely nothing to me. Every second that ticked by was a second Jada was fighting for her life on the highway. I focused every ounce of my willpower into the repetitive silent motion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the compromised plastic snapped with a sharp, distinct click. The sound was barely audible over the storm, but the enforcer possessed the sharp instincts of a professional killer. His head snapped up immediately. He dropped his phone onto the floor and raised his suppressed pistol, aiming it directly at my chest. He stood up from the wooden chair and took 2 cautious steps toward me, demanding to know what that noise was. I kept my hands firmly behind my back, keeping the severed ties perfectly in place so they looked intact. I let my head loll forward, closing my eyes and forcing my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I mimicked a man entering cardiac arrest from the severe electrical shock. The guard cursed loudly under his breath. He took the final fatal step into my striking range and leaned down to check my pulse. He made the ultimate mistake of getting within arm reach of a trained soldier. I exploded upward with terrifying speed. My hands whipped out from behind my back. My left hand grabbed the hot barrel of his suppressed pistol, violently twisting it up and away from my body. At the exact same microsecond, I drove the rigid, flat edge of my right hand directly into his throat, striking his trachea with devastating, bone-crushing force. The guard let out a sickening, choked gargle. His eyes rolled back into his head. The weapon dropped freely from his grip. Before his heavy body could hit the ground, I grabbed the collar of his jacket, swept his legs out from under him, and slammed him face first into the hardwood floor. He was completely unconscious, his breathing shallow and heavily obstructed. I had neutralized the threat in less than 3 seconds. I did not waste time looking for rope to tie him up. I quickly patted down his pockets and found a heavy ring of car keys. I grabbed his suppressed pistol from the floor, checked the loaded magazine, and shoved it tightly into my waistband. I sprinted down the wooden stairs, leaping over the flipped furniture in the living room, and charged out the front door into the freezing, torrential rain. I scanned the dark, muddy property. Tucked away behind a thick cluster of pine trees, deliberately hidden from the main dirt road, was a heavy, lifted black Jeep Wrangler. It was the perfect vehicle for navigating a treacherous mountain pass in a severe storm. I jumped into the driver's seat, completely soaking the interior with my wet clothes. I slammed the key into the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life with a deep growl. I threw the transmission into four-wheel drive, slammed my foot heavily onto the gas pedal, and tore out of the tree line. The heavy tires spun violently in the deep mud, launching thick clumps of earth into the air as the Jeep shot forward onto the narrow logging road. I drove with absolute reckless precision. I did not care about the sheer drops on either side of the dirt path. I pushed the vehicle to its absolute mechanical limit, drifting around blind corners and plowing through deep, rushing streams of rainwater overflowing the mountain gutters. The windshield wipers beat frantically against the glass, barely able to keep up with the deluge. My mind was singularly focused. Blake had said his men were tracking her at the base of the mountain. I knew the logging road fed directly into the winding two-lane county highway that wrapped around the deepest ravines in the area. That was exactly where they would execute the hit. I burst out of the tree line, and the dirt road transitioned abruptly into slick, wet asphalt. I was now on the main mountain highway. The rain was blinding, but I kept the accelerator pinned to the floor, my eyes desperately scanning the darkness ahead. As I rounded a sharp, dangerous hairpin turn, a massive flash of lightning illuminated the valley below. My heart seized violently in my chest. A half-mile down the winding road, the bright red taillights of two vehicles painted the wet asphalt in a bloody glow. It was Jada White's sedan. Directly behind her, riding her bumper with lethal aggression, was a massive, reinforced black utility truck. I watched in absolute horror as the black truck surged forward, violently ramming the back of her car. Sparks showered into the dark night as her rear bumper crumpled under the massive impact. The sheer force sent her small sedan skidding sideways across the wet lane, sliding terrifyingly close to the crumbling steel guardrail. Beyond that flimsy piece of metal was a sheer 300-foot drop into total darkness. They were pushing her right over the edge. I was driving the stolen lifted Jeep Wrangler. I saw the black utility truck accelerating rapidly, its massive steel grille locked firmly onto the rear bumper of Jada White's sedan. The highway guardrail groaned and buckled under the crushing weight of the two vehicles. Half of her rear tires were already hanging precariously over the terrifying black abyss of the mountain ravine. The driver of the black truck was relentlessly flooring the accelerator, determined to send her plummeting 300 feet down into the jagged rocks below. I did not hit the brakes. I did not honk the horn to warn them. I slammed my heavy boot down onto the accelerator pedal, pushing the powerful engine of the Jeep far past its red line. The engine roared violently over the deafening thunder of the storm. I aimed the heavily reinforced steel bumper of my vehicle directly at the rear passenger side quarter panel of the black truck. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, braced my entire body against the seat, and prepared for the massive physical impact. The collision was absolutely deafening. The sheer kinetic energy of the heavy Jeep striking the utility truck sent a massive, bone-jarring shockwave through my entire body. The steering wheel violently jerked in my hands, but the tactical maneuver worked exactly as I had calculated. The high-speed impact violently spun the black truck away from Jada's sedan. The truck completely lost all traction on the flooded asphalt, skidding wildly across the center lane. The heavy tires screeched against the wet road before the massive vehicle slammed headfirst into the solid rock face of the mountain. Steam and thick black smoke immediately poured from its crushed radiator. The horn blared continuously, stuck in a loud, monotonous wail. Jada's car spun in the opposite direction, the front tires catching the thick mud on the shoulder. Her sedan came to a violently abrupt halt, the rear bumper resting mere inches away from the completely shattered guardrail. I kicked my jammed door open and stumbled out into the freezing torrential rain. I instantly drew the suppressed pistol I had taken from the guard at the cabin, keeping the barrel aimed squarely at the smoking wreck of the black truck. The rain was coming down in blinding sheets. I approached the crushed driver's side door of the truck, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. I peered through the shattered window glass. Both airbags had fully deployed, completely covered in blood. The driver and the passenger were slumped forward, entirely unconscious and pinned tightly against the dashboard by the crushed engine block. I reached inside, grabbed a burner phone resting on the center console, and shoved it deep into my pocket. The immediate threat was fully neutralized. I turned my back on the wreckage and sprinted across the slick, rain-soaked highway toward the white sedan hanging on the edge of the cliff. The driver's side window was severely cracked from the impact. I yanked the door handle, but the locking mechanism was jammed tight. I used the heavy steel butt of the pistol to smash the tempered glass reached inside and forcefully unlocked the door. I pulled the heavy metal door open. Jada was sitting rigidly in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her hands were completely white. She was hyperventilating, struggling to pull oxygen into her lungs. Her eyes were wide open, dilated with absolute paralyzing terror. A small cut on her forehead was bleeding freely, mixing with the rain and tears streaming down her face. I reached in and unbuckled her seatbelt. I grabbed her by the shoulders and carefully pulled her out of the wrecked car and into the freezing rain. I wrapped my arms tightly around her trembling body, pulling her fiercely against my chest. I rested my chin on the top of her head, closing my eyes and thanking God that I had not been a minute too late. She buried her face into my wet jacket and began to sob uncontrollably. Her entire body shook with the violent release of adrenaline and profound fear. The deafening sound of her crying broke my heart, but it also fueled the cold, calculating rage burning deep inside my mind. We stood there in the middle of the dark, treacherous mountain highway, surrounded by twisted metal, shattered glass, and the raging storm. Jada slowly stepped back, looking up at me through the torrential rain. Her voice shook violently as she tried to form the words. She told me she had gone searching for a phone charger in his luggage back at the cabin. Instead of a charger, she found a hidden burner phone. She opened the messages and saw the frantic texts from Simon, the bank executive, regarding the massive, expedited life insurance policy. She saw the messages confirming the payout amount in the event of an accidental death. The horrific realization had finally shattered the perfect illusion. She looked into my eyes and admitted that the man she loved, the man she was supposed to marry in 2 days, was actively trying to murder her for a payout. She apologized repeatedly, her voice breaking loudly over the thunder. She begged me to forgive her for calling me paranoid, for kicking me out of her house, and for not believing me at the dinner table. I held her face firmly in both of my hands, ignoring the cold rain washing over us. I told her there was absolutely nothing to forgive. I told her that Blake was a professional predator who made his living manipulating highly intelligent, empathetic people. He had expertly exploited her grief for her mother and her desperate desire for a family. That was his crime, not her mistake. I promised her right then and there that I would burn his entire world down before I let him or his associates ever come near her again. Jada nodded, wiping the freezing rain from her eyes, the absolute panic slowly subsiding as she leaned on my strength. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her cell phone. The screen was cracked from the crash, but it was still functional. Her fingers trembled as she brought up the keypad to dial the emergency line. She said we needed to call the state police right now. She wanted to report the attempted murder, send an ambulance for the men in the truck, and have a heavily armed SWAT team raid the cabin to arrest Blake immediately. She said she wanted to see him in handcuffs before the sun came up. I reached out and firmly clamped my hand over her phone, pushing it down to her side. I looked her dead in the eyes, my expression entirely unreadable. I told her absolutely not. If we called the police right now, we would completely lose our one and only window of opportunity to truly destroy him. I explained the cold, harsh reality of the legal system to my brilliant daughter. I told her that Blake was currently sitting safely inside a warm cabin miles away from this crash site. He had completely insulated himself from the physical violence. If the police arrived, the men in the truck would invoke their right to remain silent. Blake would act completely shocked, claim he was asleep the whole time, and state that Jada simply lost control of her car in the bad weather. He would entirely deny knowing the men in the black truck. He would walk away a free man, immediately drain her offshore accounts using the documents she had already signed, and completely vanish into the wind before federal investigators could even build a solid case. He was a professional ghost, and calling the police right now would only give him a massive head start. Jada stared at me, the terrifying logic of my words sinking in. She asked me what we were supposed to do. I wiped the rain from my face and gave her the instructions for the final phase of my operation. I told her we were going to abandon these wrecked vehicles and drive the stolen Jeep straight back to Atlanta under the cover of the storm. I told her she was going to go home, take a warm shower, put on her expensive designer dress, and walk into the formal rehearsal dinner tonight exactly as planned. I told her we were going to switch from physical combat to psychological warfare. We were going to look Blake Montgomery right in his cold blue eyes, smile warmly, and let him believe he had already won. We were going to let his massive, fragile ego blind him completely to the trap closing around his neck. We drove the stolen Jeep Wrangler through the remaining hours of the dark morning in complete silence. The violent thunderstorm raged outside the heavy steel doors, but inside the cabin the atmosphere was thick with a cold, focused determination. I kept my eyes locked on the treacherous mountain road, navigating the slick curves with practiced precision. Jada sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly at the rain lashing against the windshield. She was processing a trauma that would take years to fully heal, but right now she did not have the luxury of time. We abandoned the stolen vehicle in a crowded, long-term parking lot near the international airport to avoid any immediate police connection. We took a quiet cab ride back to her neighborhood. I walked her to her front door, kissed her forehead, and told her to lock every deadbolt. I instructed her to get some sleep, pack a small bag of absolute necessities, and prepare herself mentally for the hardest performance of her entire life. I drove my own truck back to my empty house as the sun began to rise over Atlanta. The storm had finally broken, leaving the city streets washed clean. I walked inside, stripped off my blood-stained jacket, and stood under a scalding hot shower until the freezing chill of the mountain rain finally left my bones. I did not sleep. I spent the entire Sunday afternoon organizing the digital files, coordinating with my attorney, Richard Pierce, and preparing the final elements of the trap. I checked the suppressed pistol, ensuring the magazine was fully loaded, and tucked it into a specialized holster at the small of my back. I retrieved my best-tailored charcoal suit from the closet. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a grieving father or a retired engineer. I saw a man walking into a war zone dressed for a funeral. His funeral. Sunday evening arrived with a cruel, mocking beauty. The sky was perfectly clear, painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple. I pulled my truck up to the curb just down the street from Jada's new smart mansion. The property was completely transformed. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. Valet drivers in crisp uniforms were rushing back and forth. A massive white catering tent was set up on the immaculate front lawn, glowing softly with expensive string lights. The faint, elegant sound of a live string quartet drifted through the cool evening air. It was the absolute picture of high society perfection. It was the exact illusion Blake had meticulously crafted to mask his incoming slaughter. Jada walked out of her front door and walked down the sidewalk to my truck. She climbed into the passenger seat, and my breath caught in my throat. She looked absolutely stunning. She wore an elegant, floor-length emerald green gown. Her hair was styled perfectly, and professional makeup completely concealed the bruises and the small laceration on her forehead. She looked like a wealthy, radiant bride ready to celebrate her rehearsal dinner. But when she reached out to grab my hand, her fingers were as cold as ice. She was trembling, slightly terrified of walking back into a house controlled by the man who had just tried to murder her. I held her hands firmly. I looked directly into her eyes and spoke in a low, commanding voice. I told her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function through it. I reminded her that Blake was a coward who relied entirely on manipulation and surprise. I told her that tonight we held every single card. We knew his real name. We had his forged signatures. We had the burner phone from the crashed truck. We had the digital records of his offshore accounts. I told her to walk into that house, keep her chin high, and act exactly like the woman he thought he had successfully fooled. I promised her that if he made one wrong move, he would not live to see the end of the night. Jada took a deep, shuddering breath, nodded slowly, and let go of my hands. We stepped out of the truck and walked up the paved driveway together. The smart doorbell I had rewired just days ago chimed a pleasant, welcoming melody as we approached the heavy oak doors. A hired butler opened the door, bowing slightly as we entered the grand foyer. The interior of the house was packed with elegantly dressed guests. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The air was filled with the sound of clinking glasses and warm laughter. I scanned the crowded room with the trained eyes of a combat soldier, immediately identifying the exits, the blind spots, and the potential threats. Then I saw him. Blake Montgomery was standing near the base of the grand, sweeping staircase, holding court with a group of Jada hospital colleagues. He was dressed in a pristine, tailored white dinner jacket and black trousers. He held a glass of champagne in his left hand, smiling warmly and laughing at a joke someone had just told. He looked like the absolute pinnacle of success and happiness. He was fully prepared to play the role of the devastated, grieving fiance the moment his phone rang with the news of Jada's tragic mountain accident. He was entirely relaxed, soaking in the admiration of the crowd. I placed my hand gently on Jada's lower back and guided her forward into the center of the foyer. Blake turned his head to greet a waiter passing by with a tray of food. As he turned, his pale blue eyes swept across the room and locked directly onto Jada. The physical transformation was immediate and spectacular. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the flawless, charming facade completely and utterly collapsed. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a medical cadaver. His jaw visibly slackened and his champagne flute tilted dangerously in his hand. His eyes darted frantically from Jada to me and then back to Jada. I could physically see his brain short-circuiting as it struggled to process the impossible image standing in front of him. In his mind, Jada was a mangled corpse trapped inside a crushed white sedan at the bottom of a deep mountain ravine. In his mind, I was sitting on the floor of a freezing cabin bound with heavy plastic ties and guarded by an armed professional killer. Seeing us standing in the brightly lit foyer of the house he was actively trying to steal was the equivalent of watching 2 ghosts walk out of a graveyard. But Blake was a master of sociopathic deception. The sheer instinct of self-preservation violently kicked in. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He forced the color back into his cheeks by sheer force of will. He stretched his mouth into a massive, blindingly bright smile, handed his champagne glass to a confused guest, and strode confidently across the room toward us. He opened his arms wide, projecting a booming voice that echoed over the string quartet. He loudly proclaimed how thrilled he was that his beautiful bride had finally arrived. He reached out and grabbed my shoulder, squeezing it with a painful, desperate grip, and thanked me for bringing her safely. Then he turned to Jada. He reached out and pulled her into a deep, aggressive embrace. He wrapped his arms entirely around her waist and pressed his face tightly against the side of her head. From the perspective of the surrounding guests, it was a beautiful, deeply passionate reunion of a happy couple. But I was standing less than 2 feet away. I saw the thick veins bulging in his neck. I saw his knuckles turning completely white as he gripped her expensive silk dress. I saw the absolute naked panic radiating from his body. He leaned his mouth directly against her ear. His voice dropped to a venomous, razor-sharp whisper meant only for her. He told her he had no idea how the hell she had survived the mountain. He said it did not matter. He explicitly stated that there were 3 armed men dressed as catering staff currently standing in the kitchen. He pressed his fingers painfully into her spine. He whispered that she was going to smile, mingle with her friends, and pretend everything was absolutely perfect. He promised her that if she tried to run, if she tried to scream, or if she made a single move toward the front door, he would personally signal his men to shoot me directly in the head in front of everyone. Jada's body trembled violently against him. The sheer proximity to the monster who had ordered her death was overwhelming. But she remembered the conversation in the truck. She remembered the plan. She drew on a well of inner strength I had never seen before. She pulled back from his embrace. She looked him right in his cold, terrified blue eyes. She reached up, gently brushed a piece of lint off the lapel of his pristine white jacket, and flashed the most brilliant, convincing smile I had ever witnessed. She told him she would not dream of ruining their special night. She linked her arms smoothly through his, projecting a perfect image of bridal bliss, and let him lead her away into the crowded living room. The trap was now fully operational and the tiger had just walked directly into the cage. The party continued upstairs with loud laughter and soft string music. Blake played the perfect host, gliding through the crowd with absolute arrogance. He leaned close to Jada, his smile radiant, but his eyes as cold as ice. He raised his voice, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. He announced that he wanted to invite his future father-in-law and his beautiful bride down to the basement office to present a very special family wedding gift. The guests raised their glasses in a cheerful toast, completely unaware that they were applauding a monster leading his victims directly into a slaughterhouse. Jada linked her arm through his and walked forward with incredible composure. I followed closely behind them. We walked down the carpeted stairs leading into the basement. I had personally designed this specific office for Jada when she first bought the house. It was completely soundproofed with specialized acoustic panels, so she could study her complex medical files without any distractions. Once the heavy, solid oak door closed, absolutely no sound could escape. The room was entirely isolated from the noisy world above. The moment the heavy deadbolt clicked shut, the entire atmosphere violently shifted. The radiant smile on Blake's face vanished instantly. He let go of Jada's arm and took a quick step backward. His right hand reached swiftly inside his pristine white dinner jacket and pulled out a sleek black handgun. He aimed the cold steel barrel directly at Jada's chest. Jada gasped and stepped back, her shoulders pressing tightly against the mahogany bookshelf. I immediately stepped forward, placing my body directly between the gun and my daughter. The look in Blake's eyes was pure, unadulterated madness. The charming mask was entirely gone. He did not need to act anymore. He stood there, a predator completely revealed. He lowered his voice to a vicious growl and asked me exactly how Jada had managed to survive the mountain. He said his men had reported a horrific car crash, but they could not find her body at the bottom of the ravine. He glared at me with absolute hatred, realizing I was the one who had ruined his perfect execution plan. But then he let out a dry, maniacal laugh. He said my interference did not matter anymore. Dying on a freezing mountain or dying inside this soundproof basement resulted in the exact same outcome for him. He pointed the gun at my head and ordered me to walk toward the heavy oak desk sitting in the center of the room. Jada's personal laptop was open, the screen glowing brightly in the dim light. Blake tossed a small black flash drive onto the polished wood. He demanded that I immediately log into my private banking portal and execute the transfer of $2 million into his offshore accounts. He stated that the authorization forms I signed this morning had paved the way and the bank would not block the transaction. He just needed me to physically enter the final security passcode to send the money straight into his pocket. I stood perfectly still, staring directly down the barrel of his weapon. I told him that if he murdered us inside this house surrounded by hundreds of wedding guests, he would never escape. The police would arrive in minutes. He would be arrested before he could even walk out the front door. Blake sneered, his arrogance swelling to an absolute level of delusion. He reminded me that the room was perfectly soundproof. Nobody upstairs would hear a single gunshot. He proudly explained his master plan. He said he was going to shoot both of us, and then he would intentionally shoot himself in the left shoulder to stage a chaotic crime scene. He planned to tell the police that I had suffered a severe psychotic break. He would claim I brought a gun to the rehearsal dinner to murder him because I violently opposed the wedding. He would testify that Jada jumped in front of him to save his life and was tragically killed by my bullet, forcing him to return fire and kill me in self-defense. With the fake medical history of dementia he had carefully planted in Jada's mind and among her friends, the police would easily believe his story. He would emerge as the tragic, heroic survivor, the legal heir to Jada's estate, and the wealthy owner of $2 million. He pulled the hammer of the gun back with a sharp, deafening click. He began to count down from 5. He threatened that if I did not sit down and type the password, he would shoot Jada right in front of me, and then he would kill me. I looked at my daughter. She was not crying. Her eyes met mine with absolute, unwavering trust. I turned my head back to Blake, my facial expression remaining completely cold and detached. I did not show him a single ounce of fear. I pulled the heavy leather chair out and sat down in front of the glowing screen. I placed my hands on the keyboard. Blake stepped forward, standing directly behind my chair. He pressed the cold metal barrel of the gun hard against the base of my skull. I could hear his heavy, excited breathing. He smelled of expensive champagne mixed with the foul stench of raw greed. He ordered me to move my hands faster. I accessed the secure portal of the international banking system. I plugged his flash drive into the computer. The routing numbers for his hidden tax haven accounts appeared clearly on the screen. Everything was perfectly set up, waiting for one final keystroke from the account holder. He was entirely too confident in his own brutality. He truly believed that putting a gun to a father's head was the ultimate way to steal his fortune. But he had completely forgotten who he was dealing with. He was forcing a master network security engineer to type commands into a computer system that I had personally designed and installed. I decisively typed every single character of a complex 16-digit alphanumeric password. Every keystroke was steady and perfectly deliberate. My hands did not shake. I was not entering a bank transfer authorization. The sequence I typed was the master override command for the emergency lockdown protocol I had buried deep within the core server of the smart house. It was a digital bomb waiting to be detonated. I slammed my finger down on the enter key. A silent, deadly second passed. The loading circle spun rapidly on the screen. Then a bright green dialog box popped up in the very center of the monitor. The bold letters spelled out a clear message. Transaction successful. Blake saw the confirmation text. He immediately pulled the gun away from my neck. He tilted his head back and let out a massive, triumphant roar of laughter. His voice bounced off the acoustic panels, filled with the arrogant joy of a man who believed he had just successfully pulled off the greatest heist of his life. He thought he was currently holding $2 million. He thought he was the absolute master of the universe. He had absolutely no idea that my keystroke had just slammed the gates of hell completely shut, locking him permanently inside with the very demons he had created. He was laughing gleefully on top of his own grave. The echo of his laughter bounced off the padded acoustic walls. He leaned his head back, fully consumed by his own arrogance. but his manic celebration lasted for exactly 3 seconds. The bright green dialog box on the laptop screen violently flickered. The cheerful color vanished instantly, replaced by a harsh, glaring blood-red background. A large black warning symbol flashed in the center of the monitor. The text did not say anything about an offshore bank transfer. It read, "Primary lockdown protocol initiated." Blake stopped laughing. He blinked rapidly, leaning closer to the screen, his thick eyebrows knitting together in sudden, absolute confusion. He reached out and aggressively tapped the computer mouse, demanding to know what the error message meant. He looked at me, expecting to see a terrified old man who had made a typing mistake. Instead, he saw a soldier who had just successfully sprung a lethal trap. Before I could even open my mouth to answer him, the house responded. A deep mechanical groan reverberated through the concrete foundation beneath our feet. The heavy, solid oak door we had just walked through was not just wood. It was a cosmetic shell wrapped around a 2-inch thick core of reinforced ballistic steel. 4 massive electromagnetic deadbolts slammed into the steel doorframe simultaneously. The sound was like a heavy prison cell slamming shut forever. The elegant, warm, ambient lighting in the ceiling instantly cut out, plunging the basement office into total darkness for a fraction of a second. Then the emergency backup lights flickered on, bathing the entire room in a cold, unforgiving crimson glow. Blake stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor. He whipped his head around, staring in horror at the locked door. He instinctively reached into his pristine white dinner jacket and pulled out his sleek satellite phone. The device that had connected him to his team of professional killers just hours ago was completely useless. The digital signal bars on the screen were entirely gone. The screen simply flashed a stark warning that there was 0 service available. He frantically dialed the emergency override number for his armed men standing in the kitchen upstairs, but the call immediately failed. He paced the room, holding the phone high in the air, desperately searching for a sliver of connectivity that did not exist. I slowly stood up from the leather desk chair. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit and looked directly into his terrified, pale blue eyes. I did not speak with anger. I spoke with the icy, calculated precision of an executioner reading a final sentence. I asked him if he honestly thought I came over to this house last week just to fix a glitching smart doorbell. I watched his face turn incredibly pale as the terrifying reality of his situation began to sink in. I explained to him that while he was sitting in his high-rise office pretending to be a financial genius, I was systematically stripping down and rewriting the entire security architecture of his new home. I told him I spent 34 years designing maximum security containment grids for federal black sites and military defense contractors. I told him that the walls of this specific basement office were lined with a continuous, impenetrable mesh of highly conductive copper wiring. He was not just standing in a soundproof room. He was standing inside a perfectly constructed military-grade Faraday cage. Absolutely no radio frequency, no cellular signal, and no wireless network transmission could enter or exit this box. He was entirely cut off from the outside world. He could not call his armed caterers. He could not call his offshore bankers. He was completely alone with the people he had tried to murder. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The absolute control he thought he possessed evaporated into thin air. His breathing became incredibly ragged and shallow. He looked at Jada, who was standing safely behind my shoulder. She was no longer trembling. She stood tall, her eyes burning with righteous vindication, watching the monster who had terrorized her finally realize he was trapped. Blake let out a feral, desperate scream. He raised the sleek black handgun and pointed it directly at the center of my chest. His hands were shaking violently. He ordered me to unlock the door immediately, or he would blow my heart out of my chest. I did not even flinch. I took a slow step toward him. I told him in a calm, steady voice that shooting me would not magically open the steel door. I explained that I was the only person on the entire planet who possessed the biometric decryption key to disengage the magnetic locks. I told him that the system was tied directly to my vital signs. If my heart stopped beating, the door would permanently seal itself. He would rot down in this basement until the bank eventually foreclosed on the property and found his skeletal remains. He knew I was telling the absolute truth. The predator had become the prey. He violently pivoted away from me, aiming his weapon at the heavy reinforced observation window set into the upper half of the steel door. He gripped the gun with both hands, his face twisted in a mask of pure panic, and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was absolutely deafening inside the enclosed soundproof space. The explosive muzzle flash briefly illuminated his sweating face. The heavy caliber bullet flew straight toward the glass, but it did not shatter. The projectile flattened against the thick, multi-layered ballistic polycarbonate with a sharp, high-pitched crack. The deformed bullet ricocheted wildly across the room, tearing through a row of expensive medical textbooks on the mahogany shelf and embedding itself deeply into the acoustic wall padding. Blake screamed again, firing a second, third, and fourth shot directly into the glass panel. The deafening explosions made my ears ring, but the results were exactly the same. The bulletproof glass simply absorbed the massive kinetic energy, leaving behind small, harmless spiderweb cracks that did not compromise the structural integrity of the door. The slide of his handgun locked back. The weapon was completely empty. He dropped the useless metal onto the floor, his chest heaving as unadulterated terror consumed him. He rushed to the door, pounding his bare fists desperately against the steel frame until his knuckles split open and bled. He screamed for his men, completely forgetting that the soundproofing worked both ways. The wealthy guests drinking champagne just 20 feet above our heads could not hear a single thing. I watched his pathetic display of desperation without a single ounce of pity. Then the final mechanical trap activated. A low, powerful humming sound emanated from the heavy industrial air conditioning vents located near the ceiling. Blake stopped pounding on the door and looked up. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, breathing heavily. He thought the automated climate control system was turning on to cool the rapidly heating room. He was dead wrong. I had manually reversed the intake turbines during my late-night security overhaul. The heavy metal vents were not pumping fresh oxygen into the room. They were aggressively sucking the existing air out. The atmospheric pressure inside the sealed basement began to drop rapidly. A loud, sharp hissing sound filled the room as the oxygen was violently purged from the enclosed space. Blake gasped, his hands flying to his throat as he realized what was happening. His eyes widened in absolute horror. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt impossibly thin. I had trapped him inside a suffocating vault. The invincible financial assassin was now locked in a vacuum, and the clock on his life had just started ticking down to 0. The deafening hiss of the ventilation system, violently purging the oxygen, echoed through the steel-reinforced basement. Blake's face shifted from a sickly pale white to a flushed dark crimson, and finally to a terrifying shade of blue. He clawed frantically at his own throat, his pale eyes bulging in absolute panic. He staggered backwards, slamming heavily against the padded acoustic wall before sliding helplessly down to the hardwood floor. Just as his eyes began to roll back into his head, and his consciousness started to fade into the suffocating darkness, I calmly reached forward and tapped a single short command into the laptop keyboard. The heavy industrial turbines immediately reversed their rotation. A freezing, powerful blast of fresh, highly oxygenated air flooded back into the sealed room. Blake's jaw dropped open. He gasped violently, pulling massive amounts of air into his burning lungs like a dying fish suddenly thrown back into the ocean. He lay flat on the floor, coughing uncontrollably, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. I did not intend to kill him by suffocation. A quick, physical death was an incredibly merciful punishment for a predator who had spent his entire adult life systematically destroying the lives of innocent, grieving women. I wanted him completely conscious. I wanted him to witness the absolute destruction of the only thing he truly worshipped. I stepped slowly around the heavy mahogany desk. I picked up a small remote control and aimed it directly at the massive high-definition smart television mounted on the opposite acoustic wall. The large screen instantly flared to life. I used the secure network protocols I had established earlier combined with the encrypted data from Clara flash drive to mirror my laptop display directly onto the wall monitor. Blake weakly lifted his head from the floor, his bloodshot eyes locked onto the glowing screen. The display showed a highly complex, deeply encrypted international banking interface. It was a direct backdoor view into the offshore financial network he thought was completely untraceable. I watched his pupils dilate in absolute horror as he recognized the specific account numbers. Listed clearly on the screen were his primary holding accounts in the Cayman Islands, his secondary shell corporations in the Bahamas, and his emergency funds routed through Switzerland. The total cumulative balance displayed at the bottom of the ledger was a staggering number representing the stolen wealth of dozens of shattered families, including the blood money he intended to collect from Jada life insurance policy. I walked over and stood directly over his trembling body. I looked down at him and spoke with a voice colder than the mountain rain. I told him that the elegant signature he had so proudly scribbled onto my financial documents that morning did not secure him a $2 million payday. I explained that his signature was the absolute final piece of biometric evidence the Federal Bureau of Investigation required to positively identify him. I told him that my attorney, Richard Pierce, had been sitting in a federal field office for the past 6 hours. Richard had handed the authorities the biometric signature matched the audio recording of the corrupt bank executive Simon and the complete digital blueprint of his entire criminal syndicate. Blake shook his head violently, his wet hair sticking to his sweating forehead. He stammered frantically, his voice a raw, ruined whisper. He claimed it was completely impossible. He arrogantly insisted that the encryption algorithms protecting his offshore tax havens were utterly impenetrable by domestic law enforcement. He screamed that I was just running a fake simulation on the television to psychologically torture him. I did not bother to argue with a dead man. I simply pointed my finger at the massive screen. Right before his terrified eyes, the global financial network responded to the emergency federal seizure warrants. The massive $12 million balance in his primary Cayman Islands account suddenly flashed a bright warning red. In a fraction of a second, the enormous string of numbers completely vanished, instantly replaced by a stark absolute zero. The secondary accounts in the Bahamas flashed next, their balances immediately wiped clean from the server. One by one, every single fraudulent trust fund, every hidden investment portfolio, and every blood-soaked dollar he had ever stolen was permanently erased from his control. He had lost absolutely everything. Every luxury vehicle, every tailored suit, every hidden mansion across the globe was now federal property. The arrogant financial assassin who had stood in this very room 5 minutes ago holding a gun to my daughter's chest and acting like a god was now completely bankrupt. He did not even possess enough money to buy a cup of coffee, let alone hire a defense attorney to fight the massive wave of federal indictments currently crashing down on his head. The psychological blow completely shattered whatever remained of his sanity. The cold, calculating predator evaporated into thin air. He was reduced to a pathetic, cornered animal entirely stripped of its armor. He let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair. He violently grabbed his own hair, pulling at the roots as he rocked back and forth on the expensive rug. The sheer magnitude of his absolute failure crushed the last remaining fragments of his massive ego. Then the final pathetic transformation occurred. He stopped rocking and crawled across the floor toward me. He reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and desperately grabbed the fabric of my trousers. The fake, manipulative tears he had used to deceive so many vulnerable women were entirely gone, replaced by genuine hysterical sobbing. He looked up at me and Jada, his face contorted in a mask of ultimate cowardice. He wept loudly, the pathetic sound echoing off the soundproof walls. He begged for our mercy. He swore to God that he would completely disappear and never bother our family again. He frantically pleaded with me to unlock the steel door and let him run before the federal agents arrived. He promised to do absolutely anything I demanded. He offered to work for me to become my servant to confess to his crimes if only I would spare his life and let him walk out of the house. The monster who had just confidently threatened to blow my brains out was now groveling in his own tears, kissing the toe of my leather shoe, and begging a retired old man for a second chance at life. I looked down at the pathetic creature clutching my trousers. The man who had confidently promised to blow my heart out of my chest just minutes ago was now staining his expensive white dinner jacket with his own tears and snot. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for him. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply planted my heavy leather shoe firmly against his chest and pushed him backward. He tumbled onto the expensive rug, gasping for air and sobbing uncontrollably. I told him his apologies were entirely worthless. I turned my back on his pathetic display and faced the glowing screen of my laptop once again. I was not finished. Financial ruin was only the first phase of his ultimate punishment. I typed a new sequence of commands into the terminal. I told Blake to stop crying and listen very carefully to what I was about to tell him. I reminded him about the extravagant rehearsal dinner currently taking place directly above our heads. I reminded him of the massive state-of-the-art projector screen he had rented and installed in the center of the grand living room. He had proudly told Jada he prepared a beautiful romantic photo montage of their relationship to play for the guests right after the main course was served. I explained that I had secretly accessed the central audiovisual server of the smart house earlier this afternoon. I had completely deleted his ridiculous romantic slideshow. I hit the enter key with a sharp, decisive strike. A small confirmation window popped up on my laptop monitor indicating that the master broadcast sequence had successfully initiated upstairs. I turned around, looked directly at Blake, and described exactly what his wealthy prominent guests were witnessing at this very exact second. I told him that the soft, elegant string quartet music playing through the house speakers had just been abruptly cut off. The massive projector screen had rolled down from the ceiling. But instead of smiling photos of a happy couple, the high-definition screen was currently broadcasting the raw, unedited infrared security footage from the front porch. I told him that over 100 people, including Jada, respected medical colleagues, her friends, and the neighborhood elite, were watching him violently choke Clara Vance in the middle of the night. They were watching the charming, perfect groom brutally assault a defenseless woman. Blake's face contorted in sheer, unadulterated horror. He scrambled backward across the floor, pressing his hands tightly over his ears as if that could somehow stop the broadcast happening upstairs. I continued my relentless narration. I told him that immediately following the violent video of his assault, the house system was programmed to play the crystal-clear audio recording of Simon, the corrupt bank executive. I explained that the entire party was currently listening to the exact details of the $5 million accidental death life insurance policy he had fraudulently purchased. The high society guests were listening to the two men laughing over the phone about how incredibly easy it would be to manipulate a grieving daughter and steal her entire fortune. His carefully constructed mask of the perfect wealthy gentleman was being violently ripped away and shredded in front of the entire city. I stepped closer to him, my voice dropping to a hard, metallic register. I told him that the grand finale of the audiovisual presentation was a high-resolution image of his official Federal Bureau of Investigation wanted poster. His real name, his multiple criminal aliases, and his long, despicable history of predatory wire fraud were currently projected 10 feet tall for everyone in the room to read. But the audience upstairs did not just consist of shocked doctors and wealthy socialites. I explained the final fatal element of my trap. My attorney, Richard Pierce, had not just gone to a federal judge to freeze the offshore bank accounts. Richard had used the emergency federal warrants to coordinate a massive, overwhelming tactical law enforcement response. I told Blake that the men in the catering uniforms he thought were his hired enforcers had been quietly neutralized and arrested in the kitchen 20 minutes ago by undercover federal agents. The house upstairs was entirely surrounded. State police cruisers and unmarked federal tactical vehicles had completely locked down the perimeter of the estate. The flashing red and blue emergency lights were currently illuminating the pristine front lawn and shining through the living room windows. I told him there was absolutely nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide, and absolutely nobody left in the entire world who would ever believe a single lie that came out of his mouth. He was totally isolated, financially destroyed, and publicly exposed as a murderous monster. Blake curled into a tight ball on the floor, shaking violently from head to toe. The reality of his absolute destruction had finally broken his mind completely. He was trapped in a highly conductive Faraday cage, entirely unable to call for help, while an army of heavily armed law enforcement officers stood directly above him. He had spent his entire life manipulating people in the dark shadows, preying on the vulnerable and hiding behind fake smiles. I had dragged him kicking and screaming into the blinding light of total public exposure. The humiliation and the impending loss of his freedom crushed the last remaining fragments of his massive ego. He buried his face in his hands, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming magnitude of his defeat. Then, the heavy, soundproof silence of the basement office was abruptly broken. A massive, violent vibration shook the reinforced steel door. The thick acoustic walls trembled around us. Then the incredibly loud, deafening screech of a heavy industrial diamond-tipped saw biting directly into solid ballistic steel tore through the room. A bright, brilliant shower of orange sparks erupted violently from the seam of the heavy doorframe. The Federal Special Weapons and Tactics team had arrived at the basement. They were rapidly cutting through the impenetrable vault to drag the kidnapper out into the light. The deafening, high-pitched screech of the industrial diamond-tipped saw, biting into the ballistic steel door, vibrated aggressively through the floorboards beneath our feet. A brilliant, blinding shower of bright orange sparks erupted from the heavy doorframe, illuminating the dark, red-lit basement like a fireworks display. The smell of burning metal and heavy ozone quickly filled the enclosed space. The federal agents were less than 60 seconds away from completely breaching the vault. I watched Blake Montgomery stare at the showering sparks. The terrifying reality of his immediate future finally solidified in his mind. He was a man who prized luxury control and absolute superiority above all else. Now he was looking directly down the barrel of a life sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He would be stripped of his tailored suits, his expensive cars, and his freedom. He would spend the next 50 years living in a tiny concrete box surrounded by violent criminals who would gladly tear him apart. The utter horror of that impending reality snapped the final fragile thread of his sanity. His pathetic sobbing abruptly stopped. He wiped his face with the back of his trembling hand, leaving a dark smear of dirt and tears across his pale cheek. He pushed himself up from the floor, his eyes wide and completely feral. He was no longer a calculating financial assassin. He was a cornered rabid animal acting entirely on blind, desperate instinct. He frantically scrambled across the expensive rug toward the spot where he had dropped his empty handgun. He snatched the heavy metal weapon from the floor. He did not aim it at me, and he did not aim it at Jada. With a loud, agonizing scream of pure defeat, he jammed the cold steel barrel directly under his own chin. He squeezed his eyes shut and violently pulled the trigger. A hollow metallic click echoed sharply across the room. In his absolute panic, he had completely forgotten that he had already emptied the entire magazine into the bulletproof glass of the observation window. There was no ammunition left to offer him a quick, cowardly exit. He opened his eyes, staring blankly at the wall for a fraction of a second before letting out a massive, guttural roar of absolute frustration. He threw the useless handgun violently across the room. It shattered a framed diploma on the wall and clattered harmlessly to the floor. But the manic, destructive energy inside him needed an outlet. If he could not escape and he could not kill himself, he was going to take the man who ruined his life down with him. His wild eyes locked onto the heavy mahogany desk. Resting right next to the computer monitor was a vintage solid silver letter opener. It was 10 inches long, heavily weighted at the handle and honed to a razor-sharp point. Blake lunged forward and grabbed the makeshift weapon. He gripped the silver handle so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He let out a terrifying, blood-curdling scream, raised the sharp metal blade high above his head and charged directly at me. He expected me to cower. He expected me to raise my hands in terror and back away. He still fundamentally believed I was just a weak, obsolete old man. I did not retreat a single inch. I pushed Jada safely behind my shoulder and firmly planted my feet onto the hardwood floor. My mind instantly shifted into the cold, mechanical clarity of close-quarters combat. A desperate man charging with a knife is incredibly dangerous, but he is also entirely predictable. He was leading with his right arm. His balance shifted entirely too far forward, relying purely on momentum and wild anger rather than tactical precision. I waited until he crossed the center of the room, entering my immediate striking distance. At the exact millisecond he brought the blade down toward my chest, I executed a swift, calculated sidestep, completely removing myself from his direct line of attack. His downward momentum carried him blindly forward. I did not use a weapon to stop him. I used my heavy leather boot. I pivoted my hips and drove a devastating, perfectly angled oblique kick directly into the side of his leading left kneecap. The sickening wet crunch of tearing cartilage and snapping bone echoed loudly over the sound of the saw cutting through the door. Blake's forward momentum instantly collapsed as his leg buckled unnaturally beneath him. He let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pure agony. Before his body could even hit the floor, I brought my right arm up and delivered a brutal, bone-jarring palm strike directly to the side of his jaw. The impact snapped his head violently to the side. The silver letter opener flew from his paralyzed grip, skidding harmlessly across the wooden floor and disappearing under the leather sofa. Blake crashed heavily onto the rug like a sack of dead weight. He landed flat on his back, his eyes rolling lazily in his head, completely disoriented and gasping for breath. The fight was entirely over in less than 3 seconds. The seasoned veteran had just effortlessly dismantled the arrogant predator. I stood over him, smoothing my tailored suit jacket, my breathing perfectly even and controlled. I looked down at his broken, pathetic form. I told him he should have stayed on the floor. Suddenly, the screeching sound of the industrial saw completely ceased. A heavy, booming voice echoed from the other side of the door, ordering everyone to stand clear. The massive steel door did not just open. It was violently breached. A heavy hydraulic battering ram slammed into the weakened hinges. The thick ballistic steel groaned and finally gave way, crashing inward with a deafening explosive boom. A thick cloud of gray concrete dust and smoke immediately flooded into the basement office. Through the dense smoke, the blinding high-lumen white beams of tactical flashlights aggressively sliced through the darkness. The room was instantly filled with the chaotic, overlapping shouts of heavily armed federal agents. Red laser sights danced wildly across the walls, sweeping the room for threats. 5 members of the elite Special Weapons and Tactics team poured through the doorway, moving with flawless military precision. They wore heavy black body armor, ballistic helmets, and carried compact assault rifles. I immediately raised my hands high into the air, keeping my palms clearly visible and my movements incredibly slow. I yelled out that the suspect was down on the floor and entirely unarmed. 2 tactical operators instantly recognized me from the briefing provided by Richard Pierce. They bypassed me completely and converged directly on Blake. They did not treat him with any of the polite, gentle courtesy he was accustomed to receiving. They grabbed him by the fabric of his ruined white dinner jacket and violently flipped him over onto his stomach. Blake screamed in agony as they aggressively pinned his broken leg to the floor. A heavy armored knee was driven forcefully into the center of his spine, driving the last remaining breath from his lungs. The sharp mechanical ratcheting sound of heavy-duty plastic zip ties echoed in the room as they secured his wrists tightly behind his back. The commander of the tactical unit stepped into the room, lowering his weapon. He looked at the shattered glass, the broken furniture, and the bleeding criminal on the floor. He gave me a single respectful nod. The operation was a complete success. The operators hauled Blake roughly to his feet. He could not stand on his broken knee, so 2 massive agents supported his dead weight, holding him suspended by his armpits. His pristine white suit was completely covered in dark blood-gray concrete dust and his own vomit. His hair was plastered wildly to his sweating face. He looked absolutely repulsive. As they dragged him toward the shattered doorway, the last remaining shred of his humanity completely dissolved. He knew he had lost his money, his freedom, and his reputation. In his absolute powerlessness, he resorted to the only weapon he had left in his pathetic arsenal. He revealed the true, rotten core of his soul. He locked his crazed, bloodshot eyes onto me and Jada. He bared his teeth like a trapped rat and began to scream. He did not curse his bad luck. He screamed the most vile, hateful, and disgusting racist slurs imaginable. His voice was thick with venom as he cursed our skin color, our success, and our very existence. He revealed that his entire operation was not just about greed. It was fueled by a deep, burning resentment that an African-American family possessed the wealth and the intelligence that he believed he inherently deserved simply because he was born a white man. He screamed that we were nothing, that we were beneath him, and that he would eventually find a way to kill us both. The federal agents immediately shoved him forward, ordering him to shut his mouth, but he continued to violently thrash and spit his hateful venom. I did not react to his racist garbage. I had dealt with men like him my entire life. Their hatred was just a loud, empty echo of their own profound insecurity. But Jada did not stay silent. She stepped out from behind me, her emerald green gown flowing elegantly around her. She walked directly up to the struggling, screaming monster. She stopped just inches away from his face. The federal agents paused for a brief second, allowing the victim to confront her attacker. Blake stopped screaming. He looked at the brilliant, beautiful woman he had planned to murder tonight. He expected her to cry. He expected her to shrink away from his vile insults. Jada did not shed a single tear. She looked at him with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. She gathered a thick mouthful of saliva, leaned forward, and spat directly onto the toe of his expensive polished leather shoes. She looked him dead in the eyes and told him to enjoy his new concrete home. She then turned her back on him completely and walked away. The agents aggressively dragged the screaming, humiliated predator out of the basement, up the stairs, and out into the waiting police cruisers. The nightmare was finally over. The flashing red and blue emergency lights of the police cruisers painted the pristine white catering tent in a chaotic, rhythmic strobe. The elegant string quartet had long since stopped playing. The lavish rehearsal dinner had completely transformed into an active federal crime scene. I walked up the carpeted stairs from the basement, keeping my right arm wrapped tightly around my daughter. The grand foyer, which had been filled with warm laughter and clinking champagne glasses just an hour ago, was now dead silent. Dozens of wealthy guests, prominent hospital administrators, and local socialites stood frozen in absolute shock. They had just watched the horrific security footage and listened to the incredibly incriminating audio files broadcasted on the massive projector screen in the living room. They parted like the Red Sea as Jada and I walked through the center of the crowd. Through the massive front windows, I watched the federal tactical agents forcefully shove Blake Montgomery into the back of a heavily armored transport vehicle. His pristine white dinner jacket was ruined, covered in concrete dust and his own blood. He was no longer shouting racist insults. The heavy steel door of the transport van slammed shut entirely, cutting him off from the world he had tried to conquer. But the night was not quite over. As I guided Jada toward the plush leather sofa in the living room, a sudden commotion erupted near the extravagant buffet table. 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers were pushing their way aggressively through the crowd of stunned guests. They were walking directly toward a man who was desperately trying to slip out the side patio door. It was Simon, the corrupt bank executive who had sold my daughter's psychological profile and financial records for a 15% cut of the blood money, had actually possessed the sheer audacity to attend the rehearsal dinner. He thought he could stand in the crowd, drink our expensive champagne, and celebrate his impending massive payday. He had completely underestimated the efficiency of Richard Pierce and the federal warrants. The agents grabbed Simon by both shoulders, violently spinning him around. He dropped his crystal wine glass, which shattered loudly against the marble floor. His face was entirely pale, slick with a terrified sweat. He immediately began stammering, trying to invoke his status as a senior wealth manager, demanding to call his corporate lawyers. The lead agent did not even blink. He loudly recited Simon Miranda rights while aggressively pulling the banker arms behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy metal handcuffs echoed clearly across the silent living room. Simon locked eyes with me from across the room. He looked absolutely pathetic, a greedy coward who had gambled his entire life and lost everything. I did not offer him a single ounce of pity. I simply stared at him with cold, unblinking eyes until the agents marched him out the front door in total disgrace. The high society crowd watched in horrified fascination as the respected financial advisor was shoved into the back of a waiting police cruiser. With the immediate threats finally neutralized and removed from the property, the sheer weight of the night crashed down on Jada. The adrenaline that had fueled her incredible bravery in the basement completely evaporated. She collapsed onto the leather sofa, buried her face into my chest, and began to cry. It was not the frantic, terrified sobbing from the mountain highway. It was the deep, exhausting release of a profound trauma. She cried for the mother she missed, for the beautiful wedding illusion that had been brutally shattered, and for the terrifying reality of how close she had come to losing her own life. I sat there and held my daughter, resting my chin gently on the top of her head. I did not tell her to stop crying. I let her release every single ounce of pain. I simply rubbed her back and promised her over and over again that nobody would ever hurt her again. I was her shield, and the shield had held firm. A few minutes later, the crowd of guests began to slowly and quietly filter out of the house, guided by the local police who were securing the property. The heavy front door opened one last time, and Richard Pierce walked into the foyer. My attorney looked entirely out of place among the glamorous wedding decorations, wearing a rumpled gray suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. But to me, he looked like a victorious general returning from the battlefield. He walked over to the sofa and waited patiently until Jada sat up and wiped her eyes. He offered her a warm, grandfatherly smile before opening his heavy briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents enclosed in a dark blue folder. He handed the folder directly to me. Richard explained that the federal judge had not only frozen Blake offshore accounts, but had also immediately invalidated every single fraudulent document he had coerced Jada into signing. The life insurance policy was completely canceled. The forged power of attorney was legally incinerated. But Richard had taken it one crucial step further. He pointed to the top document in the folder. It was the official property deed to the smart mansion we were currently sitting in. Richard had completely restructured the ownership. The house was now locked inside an ironclad, irrevocable trust entirely controlled by Jada, with multiple layers of biometric and legal security preventing anyone from ever putting a lien on it again. The monster had tried to steal her sanctuary, and we had responded by turning it into an impenetrable fortress. I looked at the legal seal on the document, nodded my profound thanks to Richard, and handed the deed to Jada. The nightmare was officially over. 6 months have passed since that violent thunderstorm washed the absolute worst kind of human garbage out of our lives. The transition from chaotic survival to peaceful stability did not happen overnight, but the foundation of our family is now entirely indestructible. Blake Montgomery is currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary in Florence, Colorado. His highly publicized trial lasted less than 3 weeks. The mountain of digital evidence, the forged signatures, the audio recordings, and the damning testimony from his own hired enforcers completely buried his defense attorneys. The judge did not show him a single shred of leniency. He was sentenced to 40 consecutive years without the possibility of early parole. He will be an old broken man by the time he ever sees the outside of a concrete wall again. His offshore empire was completely dismantled and the recovered funds were seized by the federal government to compensate his previous victims. One of those victims was Clara Vance. She survived the horrific strangulation on the front porch and fully recovered from her traumatic injuries in the intensive care unit, because she voluntarily provided the encrypted flash drive that brought down the entire syndicate. Federal prosecutors offered her full immunity. But I knew immunity did not pay the rent. Using the private wealth I had built from my construction company, I quietly set up an anonymous, highly secure trust fund for her. It was enough money to allow her to relocate to a quiet coastal town on the other side of the country, change her name legally, and start a new, safe life far away from the criminal underworld. She paid her debt to my family by saving my daughter, and I ensure all my debts are settled in full. As for Jada, the transformation she underwent over the past 6 months has been nothing short of spectacular. She did not let the trauma break her spirit or make her bitter. Instead, it forged her into a woman of absolute titanium. She resigned from the chaotic hospital emergency room and used her reclaimed financial portfolio to open her own private surgical clinic. She is now her own boss, answering to absolutely nobody but her own ambition. More importantly, she stopped looking for an external savior to complete her life. 3 days a week after she finishes her surgical rotations, she attends an intensive Krav Maga self-defense academy. The naive girl who was easily manipulated by a charming smile no longer exists. She is fiercely independent, highly observant, and entirely capable of protecting herself in any situation. Our relationship has never been stronger. We do not have polite, superficial dinners anymore. We have deep, honest conversations based on absolute mutual respect. She no longer views me as a fragile, retired old man who needs to be managed. She knows exactly what I am capable of, and she knows the terrifying lengths I will go to in order to keep her safe. I am currently sitting in the heavy wooden rocking chair on my back porch. The Atlanta sun is slowly setting, casting a warm, golden light across my perfectly manicured lawn. I am drinking a cup of strong black coffee. On the small table next to me, a high-definition tablet displays the live encrypted feeds from the upgraded security cameras surrounding both my property and Jada Clinic. The perimeter is perfectly secure. The magnetic locks are engaged. The digital firewalls are completely impenetrable. I do not feel a single ounce of regret for what I did to Blake Montgomery. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept for Sunday morning church services, but in the real world, predators do not respond to kindness. They only respond to superior force. I learned that you cannot reason with a monster who wants to consume you. You must systematically dismantle their power, crush their resources, and lock them in a cage of their own making. I am Nathaniel Hayes. I am 68 years old. I am a father, a soldier, and an engineer. I built a life dedicated to protecting the people I love, and I will continue to stand watch over my family until the day I take my final breath. The order has been completely restored, and absolutely nobody will ever dare to threaten our peace again. The most profound lesson I took from this entire ordeal is that evil rarely announces itself with a weapon drawn. It usually knocks on your front door wearing a charming smile and offering exactly what your broken heart desperately wants to hear. We are often taught to ignore our gut instincts just to keep the peace, but true parental love is not just about giving blessings. It is about remaining ever vigilant. Never apologize for asking the hard questions, and never underestimate your own ability to fight back. The wrinkles on your face are not a sign of weakness. They are a map of survival. If you believe in protecting your family at all costs and never letting anyone underestimate your strength, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own stories of standing your ground in the comments below.